Chapter 70. What happened up there? When the women came up to ask, the older woman had already handed over the paper raft. She sighed and said, "This poem was written by Su Wentian just now. Everyone take a look." A woman took the paper raft from his hand, and in the next moment, she began to recite. Although the others were all women, they were all known as talented women in Qing and Prefectural City. After hearing a few lines, they could tell that the standard of the poem was far above that of ordinary people. What is this poem well written? Zheng Zimo's knowledge of poetry was not deep. Unless it was something like Immortal of the Magpie Bridge, that ordinary people could distinguish, she had no ability to distinguish ordinary poems. Su Wentian's Mid-Autumn Festival poem is indeed much better than Fang Zhou's. Wan Ruoqing said slowly with a complicated expression on her pretty face after the woman finished reciting. She could roughly judge the standard of the poem just by listening to it once. She had also heard the Mid-Autumn Festival poem written by Su Wentian last year. She didn't expect it to go up another level this year. She was afraid that it would shine in the poetry meet tomorrow night. Sister Ruoqing, can your poem beat Su Wentian's? Zheng Zimo looked at her and asked. She was very concerned about this. The Yunying Poetry Society's victory or defeat today would determine whether or not they had the right to participate in the true Mid-Autumn Festival tomorrow. If they won, she could enter with them, and perhaps she could see that person then. I also didn't think that Su Wentian would have such skill in Mid-Autumn Festival poem. I'm afraid I cannot compare. Wan Ruoqing shook her head and said with a wry smile. Based on this poem, Su Wentian has already won today's competition. The older woman of the Yunying Poetry Society sighed and said, although they didn't want to admit it, from ancient times until now, in the path of poetry, women were always inferior to men. Hearing this, Zheng Zimo's pretty face showed disappointment. If the Yunying Poetry Society couldn't win, then they didn't have the right to participate in the Mid-Autumn Festival. Naturally, she wouldn't be able to see the talent called Li Yi. These days, he could only keep the questions about that novel painting method in his mind. That person seemed to have appeared out of thin air, and then disappeared. No matter how others searched, they couldn't find any information related to him. Zheng Zimo could only place all her hopes on tomorrow's poetry conference. With his talent, he shouldn't be absent from that kind of poetry conference. Knowing what she was thinking, Wan Ruoqing turned to look at her and said, even if we can attend the poetry competition tomorrow, we may not be able to see the person we want to see. Zheng Zimo understood everything that Wan Ruoqing had said, but this was still a ray of hope. If they lost today, even this hope would be gone. She turned her head in disappointment, and saw that the scholar was holding a paper raft in his hand. After looking at it, the corners of his mouth curled up, and the expression she had seen before once again appeared on his face. This kind of expression was a little similar to the one she had when she saw the paintings of people who were not good at painting. Casually throwing the paper raft on the table, she said something to the young servant girl, and the two of them walked in the direction of the door. Gritting her teeth, she walked over to where the scholar had been, picked up the paper raft he had thrown away, and moved her gaze to it. What was written on the paper raft was the poem that Su Wentian had been praised by everyone. For a moment, the expression on Zheng Zimo's pretty face became very complicated, but it quickly turned into determination. She chased after the scholar's back. Zimo, Wan Ruoqing called her from behind. Seeing that she didn't seem to hear, a puzzled expression appeared on her pretty face. She put down Su Wentian's poem and followed. Miss Zimo. On the way, she met a man who cupped his hands to her, but Zheng Zimo didn't pay attention to him. When she quickly walked past, the man's smile froze on his face. His gaze followed the direction of her back. The scholar and servant girl had already walked to the door. If he had known that this poetry conference didn't allow outsiders to participate, Li wouldn't have wasted so much time here. After tasting all the fruits and pastries inside, he planned to go back with Xiao Huan. Wait! When he reached the door, a voice suddenly came from behind. Li looked back, and saw that the woman who had called him a lecher was walking over quickly. This woman, there's no end to it. Li frowned slightly, subconsciously thinking that this woman was here to cause trouble. Xiao Huan, let's go. As a man, he didn't want to fight with this crazy woman. Li took Xiaohuan's hand and was about to leave, but Zheng Zimo quickly ran a few steps and blocked in front of them. Xiaohuan looked at the beautiful woman in front of her, and a vigilant expression appeared on her face. She couldn't help but move closer to Li Yi. "What do you want now?" Li looked at her and asked with a frown. He was obviously a little unhappy. "As long as you do me a favor, we can write off all our previous grievances." Zheng Zimo looked straight into Li Yi's eyes and said through gritted teeth, "No." Li Yi said lightly and took Xiaohuan's hand, intending to leave. He really didn't care about writing off all their grievances. Whether or not they would see each other again in the future was another matter. Why would he ask for trouble? Moreover, something that could make this woman put down her pride to ask for his help was probably not simple. He wasn't familiar with her, and strictly speaking, they had some minor grievances. Why should he help her? "You. Stop." Zheng Zimo pointed at him, gritting her teeth so hard that they almost broke. Whether it was in the past or now, which man wasn't polite when they saw her? When had she ever been ignored like this? Why didn't this guy have the temperament of a scholar at all? But when she thought about how he could say those 4 words in front of so many people, she had no temperament to speak of. She had never been ignored like this. She only felt extremely wronged. Tears welled up in her eyes, and she forced them not to fall. "Sir, please wait." Li Yi and Xiaohuan had already walked out the door, and a soft voice came again from behind. His footsteps paused, and he looked back at the gentle woman walking towards him. In the end, he didn't turn and leave like before. Just now he had asked for 2 pieces of cake from her, so of course he couldn't be too heartless in front of her. The woman named Wan Ruoqing walked over and first curtsied to Li Yi, then said apologetically, "Zimo is naughty and mischievous. If she has offended you in any way, Ruoqing is here to apologize to you. Please don't blame her." Li looked at this Miss Wan, and then looked at Zheng Zimo, who was still staring at him with a pair of big eyes. He couldn't help but sigh in his heart. They were both women, but why were their personalities so different? The little servant girl stood beside him, and a bitter expression appeared on her pretty face. She already couldn't deal with a beautiful sister, and now there was another one. Second Miss, where are you? Xiaohuan can't look after the son-in-law by herself." Chapter 71. Miss Wan is too polite. I didn't take this matter to heart. The voice of the woman in front of him was extremely gentle, giving off a feeling of a spring breeze. Li cupped his hands towards her and said with a smile, "What do you mean you didn't take it to heart?" "I clearly took it to heart." Zheng Zimo watched as this scholar spoke coldly to her, but smiled at elder sister Ruoqing. She felt extremely bitter, and wanted nothing more than to pounce on him and bite him. It took her a great deal of effort to restrain this impulse. "If you don't mind, you can call me Ruoqing." Wan Ruoqing looked up at him and said with a smile. Li glanced at Zheng Zimo again and gave her a meaningful look. Zheng Zimo's beautiful eyes were spitting fire. She almost couldn't suppress the impulse in her heart. Although Li didn't say it explicitly, she understood his eyes. The meaning was, look at how gentle, polite, and likable she is. Then look at yourself. As a woman, don't you feel ashamed? Li nodded and said, "If Miss Ruoqing doesn't have anything else, I will leave first." The beautiful woman seemed to hesitate for a moment before saying, "To be honest, I do have something that I would like to ask for your help with." Li Yi's expression froze. He clearly didn't expect Ruoqing to say something like this. His words just now were just a polite greeting. His intention to leave was already very obvious. A normal person would wave goodbye. Why didn't this Ruoqing follow the rules? "Miss, please speak." Although Li Yi was curious, he still smiled and said. He had a good impression of this Ruoqing. Li Yi had imagined countless times how women in ancient times should look like. Virtuous and virtuous, suitable for home and home, refined and elegant. No matter what kind of imagination he had, of course, it didn't include smashing a solid wooden table with his bare hands, cutting off a tree trunk as thick as an arm, pointing at others like a shrew and calling them lechers. However, when he really came to this world, Li found that reality was still very different from his imagination. Until he met Wan Ruoqing, the image of an ancient woman in his heart suddenly became clear. It was as if the woman had traveled through thousands of years and walked out of a painting. She smiled and curtsied to him, and a soft voice sounded. "Greetings, young master." In Li Yi's mind, this was the style that an ancient woman should have. For this reason alone, Li Yi would listen to what she had to say. Not to mention, he had just eaten her food. If he refused before she finished, Li Yi was too embarrassed to do such a thing. Ruoqing knows that this is a bit presumptuous, but I wonder if young master could compose a Mid-Autumn Festival poem for the Yunying Poetry Club? I would be very grateful. Wan Ruoqing looked up at him. Mid-Autumn Festival poem? Li Yi stilled. Wan Ruoqing's request was a bit unexpected. If she wanted someone to compose a poem, she should find the famous scholars in the Qing and prefecture. He was just a nobody. Why did she have to find him? Zheng Zimo also paused slightly. Could it be that Sister Ruoqing also saw that this scholar was not ordinary? Wan Ruoqing nodded, and then quietly waited for his answer. Just now, when everyone was appraising Su Wentian's poem, only this scholar was joking with the little servant girl. When Wan Ruoqing walked past him, she just happened to see him throw the paper with Su Wentian's poem to the side, discard it like an old shoe. She faintly heard him say in a low voice, raising a cup to invite the bright moon, facing the shadow to form 3 people. Then he didn't say anything else. When these words entered her ears, an extremely clear image appeared in her mind. Drinking alone under the moon, facing only the bright moon and her own shadow. With just this sentence, the artistic conception had already spread out. Wan Ruoqing's attainments in poetry had already reached a higher level. Just from this incomplete poem, she could see that this scholar not only had a unique way of doing things, but in terms of poetic talent, Su Wentian's generation was far from his. However, with her personality, she would not take the initiative to ask for help. If she lost, she lost. She could only blame herself for not having enough literary talent. Only when Zheng Zimo ran out, and she heard her conversation with the scholar, did she realize that Zheng Zimo had also seen through some things. After thinking about it, she still made this presumptuous request. After all, tomorrow's poetry meet was not only what Zheng Zimo was looking forward to. At the Chinese Valentine's Day poetry meet a month ago, she was the one who picked up the sky prayer lantern that fell from the sky. The poem Immortal on the Magpie Bridge, that was written on it, was also spread by her. Even now, many people still thought that the poem was written by her. In these days, in the eyes of everyone, there had been an inextricable connection between her and the Immortal of the Magpie Bridge. However, Wan Ruoqing knew that she would not be able to compose such a poem in her lifetime. She had the same reverence and admiration towards the scholar named Li Yi as many women. If she could meet him once, she could fulfill one of her life's wishes. "Miss, are you here to participate in tomorrow's Mid-Autumn Poetry Meet?" Li Yi looked at her and asked in confusion. Wan Ruoqing smiled and said, "To be honest, the reason the Yunying Poetry Club wants to win today's competition is because there is someone we want to meet at tomorrow's Mid-Autumn Poetry Meet." Seeing Ruoqing's beautiful face reveal the adoration of a fan towards her idol, Li Yi was extremely surprised. Could it be that Wan Ruoqing, Zheng Zimo, and the other women of the Yunying Poetry Club were all going to the meet to meet a certain famous scholar? Thinking of this possibility, Li Yi suddenly felt a strong sense of envy towards that unknown fellow. There was no need to mention Wan Ruoqing. She was so beautiful, had a good personality, and seemed to be very talented in literature. As for that Zheng Zimo, although her personality was terrible, her looks and figure did not lose to Wan Ruoqing at all. Then there were the women of the Yunying Poetry Club. Scholars were so popular these days. Even these talented women were charmed. Who knew how many more ignorant girls were fans of that fellow? Li Yi always thought that the career of being the husband of a stronghold was very promising. There were beautiful sisters at home, and when he had nothing to do, he could bring beautiful servant girls everywhere. But now, compared to that person, Li Yi suddenly felt that the difference was like heaven and earth. Sigh, the heavens are blind. Doesn't he just know a few lousy poems? What's so great about it? Even a woman like Wan Ruoqing can't help but like him. Li Yi sighed in his heart, and his face showed an extremely regretful expression. In the eyes of Zheng Zimo and Wan Ruoqing, this was naturally a sign of rejection. "Forget it, Sister Ruoqing, let's go. I don't want to beg this lecture. Zengzumo raised her eyebrows and glared fiercely at Li Yi. She didn't want to be bullied by him anymore, so she pulled Wan Ruoqing's hand and was about to leave. Wan Ruoqing's pretty face also showed a look of disappointment, but she was not surprised. They didn't know each other, so it was indeed a bit too much for her to make such a request. It was also when she and Zengzumo were about to leave that the scholar's voice finally came over. Since tomorrow's poetry conference is of great significance to Lady Ruoqing, how can I refuse? Chapter 72. A gentleman helps others achieve their goals. Zengzumo turned to look at Li Yi. No matter how she thought about it, she couldn't associate the word gentleman with the scholar in front of her. After all, no gentleman would say your mother every time he opened his mouth. But no matter what, he finally agreed. However, when she thought about how he rejected her without even thinking when she asked him for help, and how he agreed so easily when it was Sister Ruoqing, she couldn't help but feel an inexplicable sourness in her heart. She looked at Li Yi with resentment. Thank you, young master. Seeing that Li Yi agreed, Ruoqing's pretty face showed a joyful expression. Don't rush, I have another condition. Li Yi spoke again. What condition? Zengzumo looked at him, and her eyes suddenly became vigilant. Although she came from a brothel, she was a pure person who only sold her skills and not her body. If Li Yi made any excessive demands, she wouldn't agree even if she didn't ask him to compose a poem. Li Yi glanced at Zengzumo, who was obviously thinking too highly of herself and didn't pay attention to her. He turned to look at Ruoqing and asked, Miss Ruoqing only wants to win today's competition, so that she can participate in the Mid-Autumn Poetry Meet, right? Wan Ruoqing nodded but didn't understand what Li Yi meant. At this time, Li Yi looked at her and said, I heard that the winner of today's poetry club will receive 100 taels of silver as a reward. I don't want anything else, just this 100 taels of silver. Helping was helping, but he still had to ask for the benefits he deserved. The girls from the Yunying Poetry Club and Wan Ruoqing wanted the right to participate in the Mid-Autumn Poetry Meet. Li Yi wanted the 100 taels of silver. Everyone took what they needed. This was a win-win situation. Wan Ruoqing was startled when she heard this. She looked up at Li Yi and nodded. That's how it should be. Even though 100 taels of silver was not a small amount to them, they didn't care about that. That was just a bonus for winning the competition. If they lost the competition, they wouldn't even have the right to participate in the Mid-Autumn Poetry Meet, not to mention the 100 taels of silver. She didn't need to ask for the opinions of those women, and could help them make the decision. Miser. All you think about is money. Zengzumo cursed in her mind. Her disdain for Li Yi was obvious. Now that the conditions were settled, the three of them turned around and walked back into the hall. Along the way, Wan Ruoqing walked beside Li Yi and said something to him. Slightly behind them, Zengzumo raised her head and glared at Li Yi from time to time. If her gaze was a knife, Li Yi would have been cut into pieces by now. The servant girl followed behind them. She looked at Li Yi for a while, and then secretly peeked at Wan Ruoqing and Zengzumo. She was still a bit uneasy. Upstairs, several people looked down. After a moment of shock, they spoke with some confusion. Who's that man with Lady Wan and Lady Zuamo? He looks unfamiliar. Probably a friend of Lady Wan. I saw him with the people from the Yunying Poetry Club. It's him. Why would Lady Wan make friends with such a vulgar person? Among these people, there were those who didn't know Li Yi. At this moment, they were shocked that Wan Ruoqing and Zengzumo were so close to a man. Some had just seen him scold Su Wentian away. They were even more shocked. How did this person get together with Wan Ruoqing, the famous talented girl of Qing Prefecture, and Zengzumo, the top artist of the Jade's Yard? They didn't even have the mood to make friends with such a vulgar person and a refined scum. Could it be that those two girls just happened to like this kind of style? At this time, the women of the Yunying Poetry Club were gathered in a corner. The poems on the table in front of them were the ones that everyone had already read. Even though they were unwilling, they had to admit that in terms of poetry, they were far inferior to those men. Could it be that we are destined to have no fate with the Mid-Autumn Poetry Meet? A girl said unwillingly. All the girls sighed and remained silent. At this time, Wan Ruoqing and Li Yi walked over. I'll leave everything to you, young master. Wan Ruoqing bowed to Li Yi and said with a serious expression. Ruoqing, this is… Seeing the scholar again, confusion appeared on the women's faces. When the older woman came forward to ask, Li Yi had already picked up a brush. He dipped it in ink and was about to write when he seemed to remember something. He turned back to look at Ruoqing and handed the brush to her. He said, let me read. Miss Ruoqing, you write. Wan Ruoqing naturally didn't know that Li Yi was afraid that her words were too ugly and would be laughed at. She thought that this young master was very thoughtful. Since this was a work that represented the Yunying Poetry Club, she naturally had to write it herself. She took the brush from Li Yi's hand. Under the slightly confused gazes of the women, Li Yi had already begun to speak. A pot of wine among the flowers, drinking alone with no companionship. It's a poem. The women exclaimed softly. Their eyes were full of surprise, but they still didn't understand what was going on. Can this guy really do it? Zheng Zimo looked at him, still uncertain. After all, she was only guessing just now. If this scholar was just an arrogant student without any talent, then wouldn't everything she had done just now be in vain? Raising a cup to invite the bright moon, the shadow becomes 3. It was also at this time that the second line of Li Yi's poem was recited. In an instant, the expressions of the rather talented women froze. In the next moment, their expressions changed. Seeing that their expressions had all become very solemn, Zheng Zimo was startled. Then, she looked at Li Yi and a thought of disbelief rose in her heart. Could it be that his poems are really that powerful? Since the moon cannot be drunk, the shadow follows me, temporarily accompanying the shadow of the moon. Joy must last until spring. Li Yi's voice continued. Beside him, Ruoqing picked up the brush and began to write. Neat and beautiful lines of hairpin-style small regular script appeared on the paper. My song lingers in the moon. My dancing shadow is messy. When awake, we are joyful. When drunk, we are separated. Forever unrequited, we meet again in the clouds. When Ruoqing finished the last word, Li Yi spoke again. This poem is called Drinking Alone Under the Moon. Zheng Zimo stood to the side in a daze. She saw that the gazes of the people around her seemed to be attracted by the poem on the paper, and didn't move away for a long time. When she turned to look at the calm scholar again, her expression began to change. After a while, the women from the Yunying Poetry Club finally moved away from the paper. They looked at each other, and an indescribable light appeared on their faces. Congratulations, Brother Su. Brother Su has great literary talent. We admire you. With Brother Su's poem, you will definitely shine at the Mid-Autumn Poetry Meet tomorrow. I will congratulate Brother Su in advance. You flatter me, you flatter me. Somewhere upstairs, Su Wentian was accepting the crowd's compliments. He kept saluting back, already forgetting the unhappiness that had just happened. His entire person felt like he was floating. Since the Qixi Poetry Meet a month ago, he had been completely suppressed by the White Dew Poetry Club. Only now did he finally turn the tables and return to the peak of his life. Brother Su's poem is truly breathtaking. Tomorrow, I'm afraid you'll be able to compete with Yang Yanzhou and Shen Zhaoji to see who's better. Opposite Su Wentian, a scholarly robed young man laughed. Brother Su exaggerates too much. I still have some self-awareness. There are many scholars in Qing'an Prefecture. Even those who are proficient in poetry would not dare to say they can beat these two. Hearing this, Su Wentian shook his head and said. The young scholar smiled, and was about to speak when a paper raft came from the side. His eyes inadvertently swept over. His gaze could not move away. Chapter 73. Brother Su, Brother Su. Su Wentian looked at the young man who had suddenly fallen into a daze. After calling him twice, the other still didn't come back to his senses. He couldn't help but feel very puzzled. Moving forward in time a little earlier. A pot of wine among the flowers, drinking alone with no companionship. Raising a cup to invite the bright moon, the shadow becomes 3 people. Since the moon cannot be drunk, the shadow follows me. Temporarily accompanying the shadow of the moon, joy must last until spring. Forever unfeeling and traveling, we will meet in the clouds. Ruoqing, this poem. As Ruoqing wrote, drinking alone under the moon, on the xian paper with graceful handwriting. The expressions of the talented women of the Yunying Poetry Club gradually changed from puzzlement to shock. After she stopped writing, the older woman turned to look at her, and opened her mouth in disbelief. How does this poem compare to what Fang Wentian did? Zheng Zimo had seen the change in the expressions of the women just now. She couldn't help but ask impatiently. Hearing this, the older woman's expression became solemn. She said, "How can the light of a grain of rice compete with the brilliance of the moon? What virtue and ability does Fang Wentian have to compare with this legendary poem?" Legendary poem. Zheng Zimo's cherry lips parted slightly. It was as if a bolt of lightning had flashed through her mind. That unreasonable guy's poetic talent was actually at such a high level? If this poem were to spread, I'm afraid that all the scholars of our Jing kingdom, no matter when or where, as long as they raise a cup to drink, they will inevitably recite, raising a cup to invite the bright moon. The shadow becomes three people. A young woman's beautiful eyes became dazed as she murmured. The performance of the talented women was not out of Li Yi's expectations. One had to know that this drinking alone under the moon, even among all of Li Bai's works, was considered the best of the best. Raising a cup to invite the bright moon, the shadow becomes three people, was a line that had been passed down for thousands of years. Who was Li Bai? He was an existence that stood at the peak of the ancient literary world. Any random poem he threw out was enough to scare people to death. Wan Ruoqing's pretty face was also filled with uncontrollable excitement. When she heard the poem, she only guessed that this young master should have some talent, but she never thought that his talent would be so high. Putting aside her personal feelings, the standard of this poem was already comparable to the immortal Magpie Bridge. Of course, in Wan Ruoqing's heart, she still preferred immortal Magpie Bridge. Putting aside the relationship between her and that poem, in the Jing kingdom, for various reasons, the development of poetry was more prosperous than that of poetry, and was more popular. As for poetry, it was indeed very popular during the previous dynasty. However, for the past 100 years, the literati of the Jing kingdom still preferred writing lyrics. Because of this, although drinking alone under the moon had a very high standard, but in terms of influence it would not surpass immortal Magpie Bridge. However, if this poem was compared to something like Fang Wentian, it would be making a mountain out of a molehill. When the shock in their hearts subsided a little, everyone's gazes couldn't help but look at Li Yi. For them, through a poem, they could see the character of the poet, and even what he was thinking when he wrote the poem. Drinking alone under the moonlight, with no one close to him, from lonely to not lonely, then from not lonely to lonely. His poetry was broad-minded, and there was no room between himself and the world. What kind of breadth of mind was this? Raising a cup to invite the bright moon, facing the shadow of three people. What kind of desolation would come after this kind of self-satisfaction? The scholar's expression was calm, but the hearts of the talented women were already filled with a myriad of emotions. Being stared at by so many women, Li Yi truly felt a little guilty. He coughed lightly, and the pretty faces of the women blushed slightly. Only then did they realize that as women, staring at a man like this was a very unreasonable action. He hurriedly returned to his seat and copied the poem from just now onto a few pieces of paper, passing it around among the crowd. Not far from Li Yi, Zheng Zimo sat there. She didn't know whether to be happy or angry at this moment. She was happy because there was hope of winning today's competition and participating in tomorrow's Mid-Autumn Poetry Meet. She was angry because the heavens were blind and gave that unreasonable person such a good talent. As for the servant girl standing next to Li Yi, although her head was still dizzy, she was very happy inside. It seemed that the son-in-law's poem had scared these sisters. Last Qixi, son-in-law had even written a poem on Xiaohuan's prayer lantern. It was called Something Something Immortal. At last month's Qixi Poetry Meet, Fang Zhou suppressed Su Wentian. If not for the immortal Magpie Bridge that appeared out of nowhere, I'm afraid he would have been the champion that day. But today, he was overshadowed by Su Wentian. If the White Dew Poetry Club doesn't have a better poem, I'm afraid they will lose this time. That's not surprising. In the field of poetry, it has always been difficult to distinguish who is better. Fang Zhou is good at Qixi poems, and Su Wentian's poem about the moon is very outstanding. It is very suitable for this mid-autumn poetry meet. It is no surprise that Feng Zhou lost to him. Speaking of which, the talented women of the Yunying Poetry Club can't be underestimated. I wonder if they have any good poems tonight? Of course they do. Lady Wan's poem about the moon is above Feng Zhou's, but it is still inferior to Feng Wentian's. Somewhere on the first floor, a few scholars raised their cups and drank, judging the outstanding works of today's poetry meet. In the end, they are just women. In that case, the winner today is definitely the Dongli Poetry Club. With this poem, I'm afraid Su Wentian won't be unknown at tomorrow's meet. A man in green said with a sigh. He took a paper raft from a passing servant, and wanted to see which poetry club had new works. That's not necessarily true. After all, there are many scholars in Qing Prefecture tomorrow. There will be no lack of good works. Whether Su Wentian can make the list depends on his luck. As they talked, they didn't realize that one of them was silent for a long time. A shocked expression gradually appeared on his face. I hope Su Wentian can make a name for himself tomorrow. This way, we can boast about him in the future and share his glory, a scholar said with a smile. Before he finished his second sentence, a voice suddenly came from beside him. Everyone wait. This voice was slightly louder, and the scholar swallowed the words he was about to say. The few of them looked at him with puzzled expressions. The scholar in green still had a shocked expression as he slowly handed over the paper raft in his hand. After the few people took it, they moved their heads closer. After a few breaths, their expressions all changed. Back to the upper floor. Brother Su? Brother Su? Su Wentian didn't know how many times he called until he reached out and shook his shoulder. Only then did the young man wake up. Brother Su, what has happened to make Brother Su so absent-minded? When he looked up, he saw Su Wentian looking at him with puzzlement. A complicated expression appeared on the young man's face. He looked at Su Wentian and handed over the paper raft in his hand. Brother Su, you take a look? Chapter 74. Su Wentian accepted the paper raft he handed over. Seeing the expression on his face, he suddenly had a bad feeling. His gaze swept over the paper raft. Not long after, a hint of surprise appeared on Su Wentian's face. Then it darkened. Who wrote this poem? He turned his head to look at the man named Su. There was no longer any trace of joy on his face. The handwriting is hairpin-style small regular script. It must have been written by one of the talented women from the Yunying Poetry Society. This poem was probably written by them. The man named Su pointed to the handwriting on the raft. He reached out and patted Su Wentian's shoulder. He sighed and said, Brother Su, you don't have much time left. Su Wentian knew what he meant. If he couldn't create a poem that surpassed the standard of this poem in a short amount of time, they would lose today's competition without a doubt. They would also lose the right to attend the poetry competition tomorrow. However, the words of the youth surnamed Su still made him want to curse out loud. What did he mean by he didn't have much time left? Even if he was given another day, a month, a year, or even a lifetime, he still might not be able to create such a poem. If he had this kind of ability, how could the title of the foremost scholar of Qing and Fu fall onto the heads of Yang Yanzhou and Xin Zhao? Raising a cup to invite the bright moon, the shadow becomes 3. This line of the poem was like an insurmountable mountain lying in front of Su Wentian, making him feel a strong sense of powerlessness just by looking at it. Unsurpassable. Impossible, this is impossible. No one in the Yunying poetry competition could create a poem like this, not even that Ruoqing Wan. Su Wentian's expression was ugly as he said, This poem doesn't seem to be written by a woman at all. A pot of wine among the flowers, drinking alone with no friends, no family, no friends. Just this point alone is enough to satisfy them. Furthermore, forever marrying without love, meeting in the clouds. How can a woman have such breadth of mind? Su Wentian was very talented. After reading the poem a few times, he had an idea. He said, Let's go take a look. I don't believe this poem was written by the Yunying Poetry Society. The youth surnamed Su also had the intention to go downstairs, so he nodded and followed behind him. At this moment, The location of the Yunying Poetry Club downstairs was already abnormally crowded. Not long after the poem spread, people started to walk over. Their expressions were complicated, but there was also a hint of admiration. There were so many scholars here, but they couldn't even compare to a few women. This inevitably made the men lose face, but that poem was really well written. At this time no one mentioned Su Wentian's name. The excellent mid-autumn poem he had just composed was also forgotten by everyone. The exuberance of young Mrs. Talent truly causes all of us to feel ashamed and resentful. After today, I'm afraid the title of the most talented woman in Qing and Prefecture will belong to Miss Wan. She's not just the most talented woman. If this poem were to be presented at tomorrow's poetry competition, I guarantee that even Yang Yanzhou and Xin Zhao would have to concede defeat. We are fortunate enough to be able to witness such a legendary poem. We have no regrets. All the girls heard were words of praise, far more than what Fang Wentian had just said. There were even people who compared the top 2 scholars in Qing'an Prefecture to her, and came to the conclusion that they were far inferior. All of this was because the standard of this drinking alone under the moon was truly high to the heavens. The talented women of the Yunying Poetry Club were surrounded by the crowd. Their faces were full of excitement. Naturally, there were also many people surrounding Wan Ruoqing. Hearing their praises, her face was slightly embarrassed. She glanced at Li guiltily. Seeing him smiling at her, her face became even redder. That poem, it was clearly written by the son-in-law. The little servant girl at the side pouted and muttered in a small voice. In her heart, she was angry for the son-in-law. When Su Wentian and the youth surnamed Su came downstairs, they were blocked outside the crowd and couldn't squeeze in. Everyone make way, make way. Don't push who stepped on my foot. Damn it, which shameless scoundrel touched my butt? The two of them squeezed in with great difficulty and instantly attracted the dissatisfaction of the crowd. When they turned their heads and saw that the person who came was Su Wentian, their expressions became strange and they made way for him. After all, if it wasn't for the sudden appearance of a super dark horse, the person who had the last laugh today would have been Su Wentian. Gaining and losing, the taste in his heart was probably not good at all. Everyone also wanted to see his reaction. It would be best if he would give a speech about not receiving the award. Under the gaze of the crowd, Su Wentian walked next to the women of the Yunying Poetry Club. He first raised his hands in greeting and said, "This drinking alone under the moon is the peak of Mid-Autumn Festival poetry. I, Su, am full of admiration." At this point the topic suddenly changed. I wonder which talented woman of the Yunying Poetry Club wrote this poem. Among the women, the face of the younger girl changed slightly. Even though it quickly returned to normal, Su Wentian still caught it. The corners of his mouth curled into a smile. There was indeed something fishy about this. Is it Lady Wan? Su Wentian looked at Wan Ruoqing with a smile that was not a smile. No. Wan Ruoqing shook her head. No matter how much she wanted to win today's competition, she couldn't say such untruthful words. Could it be Lady Zimo? Su Wentian turned to look at Zheng Zimo and asked, "I don't have such literary talent." Zheng Zimo shook her head and said, "Then, there's no need to ask. This poem was written by this young man." It was obvious that Su Wentian was deliberately trying to embarrass them. Before he could finish, Wan Ruoqing pointed at Li Yi beside her and said. Li Yi looked at Wan Ruoqing helplessly and couldn't help but sigh in his heart. This young lady is really honest. As soon as Wan Ruoqing's voice fell, there was an immediate uproar. What? This poem wasn't written by Lady Wan. That scholar can actually produce such a masterpiece. If that's the case, this poem can't be counted as written by the Yunying Poetry Society. What a pity. If this wasn't the case, this poem would have won the competition tomorrow. Seeing the astonished expressions on everyone's faces, Fang Wentian revealed a smile. He looked at Wan Ruoqing and said, "If I remember correctly, other than the poetry clubs, outsiders are not allowed to participate in this competition, right?" The faces of the few women from the Yunying Poetry Society changed slightly. There was indeed such a rule in today's competition. However, every poetry society would invite a few scholars that they were familiar with. If they could compose a good poem, it would count as a poem from their own society. This was something that everyone had a tacit understanding about. However, rules were rules. If they were serious, poems written by outsiders naturally did not count. Thinking of this, their hearts all sank. What if this young man isn't an outsider? At this moment, a voice suddenly came from the side. Chapter 75. The leader of the Yunying Poetry Society, the slightly older woman, walked over. She looked at Su Wentian and said, "What if this gentleman is not an outsider?" "What do you mean, Miss Zhao?" Su Wentian asked with a frown. "To be honest, this gentleman has long joined the Yunying Poetry Society. His poems can naturally represent us," Zhao Yunru said slowly as she looked around at the crowd. When these words were spoken, the women of the Yunying Poetry Society, including Wan Ruoqing and Seng Zimo, all froze. This gentleman, when did he join the Yunying Poetry Society? Li Yi also stilled. When did he join the Yunying Poetry Society? How come he didn't know? At this moment, Li Yi saw the woman winking at him discreetly, and he immediately understood what was going on. Yes, from now on he was a member of the Yunying Poetry Society. At the same time, an uproar immediately came from the surrounding crowd. How is this possible? He is a man. The Yunying Poetry Society has always only been women. When has a man ever joined? Clearly, Zhao Yunru's words just now had a great impact on them. The Yunying Poetry Society was formed by the talented women of Qing and Prefecture and had never accepted any men. Where did this person come from? The Yunying Poetry Society has always only been women. This is something everyone knows. Miss Zhao, please do not joke. Su Wentian still had a faint smile on his face. Zhao Yunru's words were clearly just a temporary measure. However, she used the wrong method and could not be exposed. Oh. Hearing this, Zhao Yunru looked at the crowd with a slight smile and said, "When did we say that the Yunying Poetry Society only allowed women to join?" The smile on Su Wentian's face froze. The surrounding hubbub also gradually quieted. A sliver of shock floated onto everyone's faces, and they revealed thoughtful expressions. Very quickly, they realized that from beginning to end, the Yunying Poetry Society seemed to have never said such a thing. It was only because of the name of the Yunying Poetry Society and the fact that the members were all women that they naturally had their previous thoughts. However, the leader of the Poetry Society had personally refuted the rumors and denied that only women could join the Yunying Poetry Society. What else could they say? No wonder when this scholar came in, he was so familiar with Lady Wan and the women of Yunying Poetry Club. It turns out that he is also a member of Yunying Poetry Club. The Yunying Poetry Club actually allows men to join. It turns out that we have been mistaken all along. This way, this poem can naturally represent the Yunying Poetry Society. If they can participate in tomorrow's Mid-Autumn Poetry Meet, with this person there, Yang Yinzhou and Shen Zhao will have to die on the spot. I'm afraid the title of the #1 scholar in Qing'an Prefecture is about to change hands. That's not necessarily the case. Although this poem is good, every time Shen Zhao writes a poem, it will be widely circulated in the brothels and music halls. No matter how good the poem is, it can't be compared to it. Just now, everyone had only thought that Zhao Yunru's words were a ploy. However, when they thought of how the scholar had headed straight for the Yunying Poetry Society, when he came in and behaved intimately with Wan Ruoqing and the others, they thought that they already knew each other. There was no longer any doubt in their hearts. The two scholars who had followed Li Yi and stood at the back of the crowd and stared dazedly at him. They murmured, "So that brother really does know Lady Wan. He is also a member of the Yunying Poetry Society. You hid it so well from us." Su Wentian's expression was dark. He had not thought that one sentence from Zhao Yunru would turn his attack into nothing. That scholarly scum was actually a member of the Yunying Poetry Society. This was far beyond his expectations. However, he was not willing to give up just like this. Tomorrow's Mid-Autumn Poetry Meet would be his time to shine and amaze the world with a single brilliant feat. He would not allow anyone to ruin it. Raising his head to look at Zhao Yunru, he gritted his teeth and said, "Even so, this poem does not count because today's competition is competing in Mid-Autumn Poetry Festival, not Mid-Autumn Poetry Festival. Hearing Su Wentian's words, Zhao Yanru was first slightly startled. Then she said with slight anger, "What's the difference between poetry and poetry? Even the Mid-Autumn Poetry Meet has always been about poetry." Hearing this, Su Wentian said lightly, "But today, we are competing in Mid-Autumn Poetry Festival. Lady Zhao cannot deny this, right?" Zhao Yanru was momentarily speechless. She could not find a reason to refute. At that time, when the few poetry societies set the rules, they did not consider this kind of situation. This was because talents who were good at writing poems were very rare. At the poetry gathering, poems usually took up more than 90% of the time. Even if there were poems, they were all mediocre. Therefore, there was no difference whether they competed for Mid-Autumn Festival poems or Mid-Autumn Festival poems. In the end, one of the poems would be the winner. She had never thought that Su Wentian would take advantage of this loophole. This way, this Mid-Autumn Poetry Festival, that would be passed down through the ages, would not count today. After Su Wentian finished speaking, all of the surrounding candidates frowned. This Su Wentian is too narrow-minded. Even if this person has some talent, he will not be able to become a great person. I never thought that Su Wentian would be this kind of person. That day when the rules were set, they actually neglected this point. Otherwise, this situation would not have happened. Even though Su Wentian is somewhat shameless, but this time, he is really standing on the side of reason. What a pity. If this piece of work won in the Mid-Autumn Poetry Meet, we would also be honored. What a pity. After today, Su Wentian's image in the eyes of many scholars would definitely plummet. However, at this moment he could not care less. If he could make a name for himself in the poetry meet tomorrow, then he would gain much more than he would lose. So this means that the winner today will definitely be Brother Su? The youth with the surname Liu, who had just clashed with Li Yi, laughed and looked at Li Yi and the other women from the Yunying Poetry Society. Zhao Yunru and the other women from the Yunying Poetry Society were filled with anger, but they could not speak. Zheng Zimo was somewhat anxious. Her heart was filled with great disappointment after the initial surprise. Did he still fail in the end? Young master, this is all Ruoqing's fault. I did not explain this to you beforehand. Wan Ruoqing looked at Li Yi apologetically. Her eyes were slightly red as she spoke softly. If she had thought of this earlier, the current situation wouldn't have happened. Yunying Poetry Society, what a pity. There is no need to be too pessimistic. After today, just this poem alone will be enough for that scholar to become famous in the entire Qingnan prefecture. The Yunying Poetry Society will also be known by everyone. Su Wentian has lost the support of the people. Although he won, he lost. Although the Yunying Poetry Society lost, it was still glorious. The rules could not be changed. Although the scholars present did not like Su Wentian's actions, they could only sigh at the Yunying Poetry Society. Putting aside this poem, Su Wentian's Mid-Autumn Festival poem truly surpassed everyone else's. I'm afraid I have to congratulate Brother Su in advance. The youth with the surname Liu smiled and saluted Su Wentian. Brother Liu, it's too early to say that. Su Wentian clasped his hands together and said humbly. Li Yi let out a long sigh as he watched the two of them hypocritically echoing each other. Young master. Wan Ruoqing looked up at him apologetically. Just as she was about to speak, Li Yi waved his hand. He looked at her and said somewhat reproachfully, "You should have said earlier if you wanted a poem or not." Chapter 76. At first, Wan Ruoqing had said that she wanted to compose a Mid-Autumn Festival poem, but the only one Li Yi could recite was Su Shi's Shuidiao Getu. However, Shuidiao Getu had stood at the pinnacle of Mid-Autumn Festival poems for thousands of years. Once this poem came out, all other poems were useless. The standard was so high that it could scare people to death. In this small competition, Li Yi really could not bear to take it out. After all, that kind of poem, if he took it out, there would be one less poem. Just for 100 silver, it was really not worth it. When he came in, he talked with Wan Ruoqing and found out that both Mid-Autumn Festival poems and Mid-Autumn Festival poems could be used. The first thing he thought of was Li Bai's, Drinking Alone Under the Moon. This was also one of the few poems that Li Yi could recite without cheating. The other one was raising my head to look at the moon, lowering my head to think of my hometown. Although there were only 4 lines in Quiet Night Thoughts, it became Li Bai's most influential work. Every child who started to learn ancient poetry, the first line they had to recite was "The moonlight in front of my bed. I suspect it to be the frost on the ground." Thus, in Li Yi's heart, this poem was far more important than drinking alone under the moon. He was not willing to take it out. He did not think that this stupid poetry competition would only allow people to compose lyrics and not poems. If that was the case, it would be better to just call it a poetry competition. What a waste of people's time. You should have said so earlier. Wan Ruoqing raised her head and looked at him. Suddenly, some hope rose in her heart. "Young master, what do you mean?" Li Yi actually did not have any other intentions. The earlier he finished here, the earlier he could go home for dinner. "I'll have to trouble Miss Ruoqing to write again." Li Yi looked at her and smiled. At this time, Ruoqing finally understood the meaning of Li Yi's words. He actually wants to compose another Mid-Autumn Festival poem on the spot. 4 poetry gatherings like the Double Seventh Festival, or the Mid-Autumn Festival. The theme was unusually clear. The poetry gatherings were limited to the Double Seventh Festival and Mid-Autumn Festival poems. The scholars who participated in the poetry gatherings usually started preparing long before the event. They even spent months to polish their poems and refine every word. Only then would they be able to produce the stunning moment of the poetry gatherings. If they were asked to compose lyrics on the spot, even the so-called foremost scholar of Qing'an Prefecture would most likely only be able to come up with a mediocre piece. After Drinking Alone Under the Moon was rejected, it was practically impossible for them to come up with another Mid-Autumn Festival poem that could surpass Su Wentian's in a short period of time. They didn't have any hope at all. "Miss Ruoqing." Li Yi saw that Wan Ruoqing did not move, so he waved his hand in front of her eyes. After Wan Ruoqing came back to her senses, she glanced at Li Yi again and hurriedly picked up the brush. She spread out another piece of rice paper and stood quietly by the side, waiting for Li Yi to speak. Although she didn't know why this young master didn't write on his own this time, she was only puzzled for a moment before she immediately listened to his arrangements. Her action naturally aroused the curiosity of the crowd. What is Miss Wan doing? Is she going to write another Mid-Autumn Festival poem? Even if she really did it, it's impossible for her to surpass Su Wentian. Many of the candidates sighed in their hearts. No one thought highly of Wan Ruoqing. After all, even the Mid-Autumn Festival speech that Su Wentian had meticulously prepared was suppressed by him. How could he possibly beat the other party with his improvisation? When Su Wentian saw this, a mocking expression appeared on his face. If Ruoqing's meticulous preparation for the past few months was enough to threaten him, the lyrics she wrote on the spot probably wouldn't be as good as the one she just wrote. "Ruoqing." The women of the Yunying Poetry Society also guessed the same. Zhao Yunru looked at her and opened her mouth. In the end, she could only sigh. Only Zheng Zimo looked up at Li Yi. She had seen everything that he had whispered to Wan Ruoqing. "Partridge Sky." Just at this time, Li Yi spoke lightly. "Partridge Sky." Some of the candidates' expressions froze. "It's a poem," someone immediately said. So the lyricist was that brother. Everyone immediately understood. However, because of this, their confidence in the Yunying Poetry Society decreased a bit. Even though poetry was often mentioned together, there were great differences in both style and rhythm. To study one of them required a great deal of time and energy, not to mention someone who was a master of both poetry and poetry. Such a talent would have long been famous throughout the world. There was no way they wouldn't recognize him. The standard of Drinking Alone Under the Moon was already high enough to make them gasp in surprise. If a poem written on the spot could beat Su Wentian, then Su Wentian wouldn't be the only one who would feel ashamed. Su Wentian's smile remained on his face, his heart full of confidence. Not to mention that the person in front of him was only an unknown scholar. Even if the #1 scholar in Qing'an Prefecture wrote a poem on the spot, he wouldn't be afraid. When the time came, the work would be mediocre again. Let's see how they clean up the mess. When Li Yi's voice came, The women of the Yunying Poetry Society paused. Then, they abruptly raised their heads, hope rising in their eyes. It was the same scene as before. Could this young master once again reverse the situation? Zheng Zimmel looked at the scholar's calm expression. For some reason, her heart suddenly calmed down. It was also at this time that Li Yi's voice once again clearly reached everyone's ears. Blowing through the lingering smoke into the night wind, a bright moon hangs above the curtain. When the night wind blew through the thin mist, and the bright moon hung outside the curtain uncontrollably appeared in their minds, the expressions on their faces froze. Because the road is far, the person is still far. Even if our hearts sleep together, we are not together. Li Yi's voice continued. It was as if Ruoqing was using graceful and agile hairpin-style small regular script to transcribe the words onto the Xian paper. Deep in love, deep in thought, the blue clouds return without a trace. Only like in a previous life, love separated mandarin ducks in 2 cages. After reading Lu Yong's Remembering Your Charm, Li Yi picked up the tea beside him and took a sip. Only then did he realize that the venue had suddenly quieted down. The little servant girl blinked her large eyes and unconsciously moved closer to Li Yi. The atmosphere was eerily quiet, and the young girl was somewhat afraid. A moment later, a sound finally came from the venue. Su Wentian turned his head. The expression on his face was indescribable. He opened his mouth, but did not say anything in the end. He pushed through the crowd and walked out without a word. Only when his figure disappeared through the door did an uproar suddenly erupt from the crowd. Using a long and slow poem to describe parting and yearning, although it is plain and unadorned, it is incisive. It seems plain and straightforward, but it shows even more the sorrow of parting. I did not think that brother would be a master of both poetry and poetry. I am impressed. In an instant, many people with complicated expressions cupped their hands towards Li Yi and said, Su Wentian knows that he is not as good as brother, and has already left. Today's competition is won by the Yunying Poetry Club. Although the process was complicated, in the end they still won. All the women of the Yunying Poetry Club had expressions of joy on their faces. Occasionally, they would use their beautiful eyes to secretly examine Li Yi. His entire poem was filled with the sorrow of parting. This young master was probably thinking of his lover. They just did not know which woman was so lucky to be able to receive the favor of this young master. At this time, in the hearts of these talented women, this handsome young master, who was a master of both poetry and poetry, had long surpassed Yang Yanzhou, Xin Zhao, and the others. He was almost at the same level as the Li Yi of the Immortal of the Magpie Bridge. Chapter 77. Although this Remembering Your Charm wasn't Lu Yong's best work, but as the saying goes, where there's water, one can sing willow poems. Lu Sanbian's talent wasn't just for show. Any random piece he took out wasn't something any random cat or dog could compare to. Su Wentian's literary talent was unknown, but he knew his own limitations. This could be considered an advantage. After Su Wentian left, the people of the Dongli Poetry Club also left dejectedly, including some people who were close to Su Wentian. They did not have the face to stay here anymore. After all, Su Wentian was too cocky just now. Unfortunately, the higher he climbed, the more painful the fall. Not only did it cause the Dongli Poetry Club to lose the right to participate in the Mid-Autumn Festival, Su Wentian himself would not be able to stand among the other scholars in the future. If it wasn't for young master today, it would be us who left just now. The leader of the Yunying Poetry Club, a woman called Zhao Yunru, brought over a tray covered with a red cloth. She bowed slightly and said, These 100 taels of silver are for today's champion. Please accept them and don't refuse. Thank you, Miss Zhao. I won't stand on ceremony then. Li Yi smiled as he took the tray from Zhao Yunru. The smile on his face became even brighter. He really had nothing to decline. This 100 taels of silver was his ultimate goal. If it wasn't for the Yunying Poetry Club, he wouldn't be able to get the silver no matter how good his poems were. Similarly, if it wasn't for him, the Yunying Poetry Club wouldn't be able to have the last laugh and obtain the right to participate in the Mid-Autumn Festival. Everyone took what they needed, no need to stand on ceremony. A poetry competition like this should be held a few more times. Throwing down poems, taking the money and running. Wouldn't that be much easier than carrying candied fruits all over the streets? Of course, Li only thought about it in his heart. Such a good thing couldn't be encountered every day. It was more reliable to do business honestly. After all, business could prosper the country. He wrapped the silver in the red cloth, stuffed it into the little servant girl's arms, and rubbed her head as he said, "Xiao Huan, take the silver. Let's go home." 100 taels of silver was about 7 or 8 caddies. It wasn't heavy for the little servant girl. Xiao Huan had already experienced son-in-law's ability to earn money, and was already used to it. She hugged the silver to her bosom, her little face full of smiles. In addition to the silver in her bosom, the servant girl also held tightly onto 2 folded pieces of paper. On the paper were 2 poems written by the young master. Xiao Huan was illiterate and could not remember those 2 poems. Just now, when those people were passing them around, the little servant girl secretly kept 2 pieces and planned to bring them home to show Miss and Second Mississippi. Just now, the elder sister said that the poem written by the son-in-law was about the sorrow of parting. It was about longing for one's beloved. Could it be that he was talking about Miss? If eldest Miss knew, she would definitely be very happy. That time, the son-in-law did not return for the whole night. Everyone thought that the son-in-law had run away. Young Miss did not show any reaction on the surface, but that night, she was actually like Xiao Huan, unable to sleep the whole night. The young Miss would also be shocked when she saw the son-in-law's poem. The little maidservant thought to herself, after all, it was not a waste of time. Li Yi's mood was also a little better. Just as he was about to leave with Xiao Huan, he saw Zheng Zimo standing there. His footsteps paused slightly, and after a moment of thought he walked over there. Zheng Zimo saw him walking over, and the expression on her face slightly froze. She subconsciously asked, "What are you going to do?" Li Yi cupped his hands at her and said, "Miss Zimo, I did not mean to offend you that day. I just mistook you for a friend of mine. If I disturbed you, I hope you will not blame me." Because of his mood just now, Li Yi's attitude towards Zheng Zimo was not so friendly. But after all, it was his fault. In this era, holding a woman's hand was already a very serious offense. It was understandable for the other party to call him a lecher. Of course, these 2 sentences at this time were not asking for forgiveness, but just expressing his attitude. After all, they had stood on the same front and fought together. A mistake was a mistake. Even if they would not have a chance to meet again in the future, some words were said, and their thoughts would eventually be more clear. Hearing Li Yi's words, Zheng Zimo's expression was slightly startled. He would actually apologize to her. This was something Zheng Zimo had never thought of. After experiencing what had just happened, Zheng Zimo was already very clear in her heart that even though this scholar was unreasonable, his talent was shockingly high. At the very least, he was much better than Su Wentian, and perhaps he wasn't inferior to Yang Yinzhou or Xin Zhao. Which one of these geniuses wasn't a proud and arrogant person? In public, he would bow his head and apologize to a woman, but she had also seen many scenes. After a moment of surprise, the expression on her pretty face quickly returned to normal. She bowed slightly to Li Yi and said, "Since it was not intentional, there is no need to mention this matter in the future." Li Yi did not know that Zheng Zimo had already thought that what happened that day was only a misunderstanding. What she wanted was exactly Li Yi's attitude. Originally, he thought that she would call him a lecher like before. Li Yi had already mentally prepared himself for this. He did not think that she would actually bow and return the greeting. It was clear that she did not intend to pursue the matter. "I wonder if you will participate in tomorrow's Mid-Autumn Poetry Meet?" At this time, Zhao Yunru walked over and asked Li Yi with a smile. In Zhao Yunru's view, with the talent he had displayed today, if he could participate in the Mid-Autumn Poetry Meet, he would definitely shine. At that time, it would not be impossible for him to surpass Yang Yinzhou and Xin Zhao, and obtain the title of the #1 scholar in Qing'an Prefecture. "To be honest, Miss Zhao, I have no interest in the poetry meet." Li Yi smiled, and then raised his hands in a salute to the crowd. He said, "It's getting late. If there is nothing else, I will leave first." Hearing the first half of his words, the women of the Yunying Poetry Society were stunned. The poetry meet that they dreamed of participating in the eyes of the other, was not even worth mentioning. At this time, in Wan Ruoqing's mind, the image of him casually tossing Su Wentian's poem to the side floated up. Her heart suddenly felt relieved. This young master does things differently from normal scholars. He is most likely a noble person, and does not care about empty reputation. Also, with his talent in poetry, he does not need to compete with others. As she thought this, she suddenly seemed to remember something. Her expression changed slightly. When she turned her head, the figure of the scholar and the servant girl had already disappeared through the door. I was only thinking about the poem just now, and forgot to ask for that young master's name, she exclaimed softly and hurriedly chased after them. After a moment, Wan Ruoqing stood on the street and looked at the bustling crowd. She could not see the end of the crowd. She gave a long sigh and turned to walk back. Chapter 78. Because of the poetry recital, they had wasted too much time. By the time Li Yi carried the servant girl back to the stockade village, the sun was already setting in the west. The servant girl's physical strength was much weaker. After walking for a day, she was so tired that she could not even walk when she was halfway back. At first, when Li Yi proposed to carry her on his back, the young maidservant kept on refusing. She gritted her teeth and walked a few steps, almost falling down. Li Yi did not allow her to say anything and lifted her up. The young girl resisted a few times but was unable to break free. She could only obediently adjust her posture and lay on his back. When Li Yi first came to this world, his body was still weak. However, Li Yi had been consciously training every day for the past 2 months. Recently, he had been learning martial arts from Lu Rui. Although he could only make a few good postures and was not very useful, his physique was obviously much stronger than before. At least, it was about the same as a normal person. Although the young girl's face was round and had some baby fat, she was petite and had a very slim figure. Li Yi did not feel that it was too heavy to carry her. Along the way, he occasionally told some jokes, which made the young girl giggle. Her body trembled on Li Yi's back. Sometimes, she would interrupt and say a few words. Later on, Li Yi did not speak much. He only listened to the servant girl talk non-stop. Of course, Xiaohuan did not have so many stories in her head. What she talked about was nothing more than things that happened when they were young. Xiaohuan and Lu's sister Rui grew up together. Naturally, they were part of the story. When she was alone with Li Yi, she did not have so many scruples when they spoke. Sometimes, she would unintentionally talk about some interesting things that happened between the two girls when they were young. For example, Second Miss was mischievous at that time. She did not practice martial arts properly, and was punished by the master. She took a wooden sword and randomly slashed in the courtyard to vent her anger. She accidentally damaged the master's favorite flower. She threw the sword down and sat in the courtyard crying. Xiaohuan could not stop her, so the two of them cried together. Later on, eldest Miss took the initiative to tell Master that she was the one who damaged the flowers. Master punished her by locking her in the room to reflect on herself, and forbade her from eating for a day. Xiaohuan and Second Miss hid half a steamed bun each, and passed it to her through the window. As she spoke, the young maidservant had a smile on her face. As she spoke, her voice grew softer and softer. It wasn't until Li Yi felt that the young maidservant's breathing had gradually steadied that he discovered that she had fallen asleep. In order not to wake up the servant girl, Li Yi slowed down his pace and tried his best not to shake. However, when he walked back to the stockade village, there was only a small amount of light in the sky. When he passed through the stockade and walked home, he bumped into the woman with the waist of a bucket. It was unknown if Lady Wu had done it intentionally or not, but when she brushed past Li Yi, her body suddenly tilted. Although Li Yi's physical strength had increased over the past few days, he was clearly at a disadvantage in terms of weight. He immediately staggered from the collision, and managed to stabilize himself with great difficulty. However, the young maidservant on his back was startled awake. Madame Wu curled her lips, a mischievous smile on her face. Son-in-law. She softly muttered a few words and rubbed her sleepy eyes. The small bundle on her arm fell to the ground, and when it landed, It scattered and a few silver ingots rolled out. It was a familiar scene. Madame Wu lowered her head to look at the silver ingots on the ground with a lifeless expression. The mischievous smile on her face had long disappeared. She couldn't suppress the impulse in her heart. She wanted to rush up and snatch the silver and run away, but in the end, she couldn't turn her thoughts into reality before Li Yi picked up the silver. Even after Li Yi and Xiao Huan's figures disappeared, and the sky had completely darkened, the woman with the waist of a bucket was still standing in the same place, as if she had become a statue. It was rare for him to wake up early. Li Yi pushed open the door and walked into the courtyard. He stretched his body. The weather had just entered autumn, so there wasn't much of a chill. The morning sun shone on his body, warm and comfortable. The sky was blue, and only a trace of clouds could be seen in the distant horizon. Although the air was fresh, at this time, Li Yi couldn't help but miss the mellow haze of an ancient city in the northwest. However, in this life, he was afraid that he wouldn't be able to smell that familiar smell again. The little maid came out of the inner courtyard and rubbed her sleepy eyes. She planned to wake the son-in-law up as usual. When she looked up, she was slightly stunned and then smiled. "Son-in-law, good morning." Standing in the courtyard, she watched the son-in-law slowly do a strange action, which didn't look like a martial arts move. After a while, the little maid went to the kitchen to prepare breakfast. Li Yi continued to do Tai Chi slowly, sorting out some things in his mind. The problem of the shop could now be solved. He could first release a small batch of floral dew and see the reaction of the market. As for the factory, it was time to start the construction. These things could be left to Fong and others. Li Yi couldn't intervene in the construction of the house, but the site had to be close to the water source. The layout of the room also needed to be discussed with Fong in advance. Other things couldn't be rushed for the time being. The road had to be taken step by step. Fortunately, although the process was a little tortuous, it had been developing. The only thing that made him a little regretful these days was another thing. He originally thought that under the blessing of the protagonist's halo, it would be easy for him to practice martial arts and advance by leaps and bounds. It wouldn't take long for him to become the world's #1 martial arts master. With a wave of his hand, he could destroy strong enemies and become the man with the highest martial arts value in the family. This goal seemed to have been achieved. In short, it was the kind of very, very powerful. However, the reality was cruel. The dream of becoming a top master would probably never be realized. These days, he could only put on an empty stance. He learned the moves very fast, but there was no lethality. As for the so-called internal force and genuine qi, he didn't feel it at all. In the words of Lu Rui, his aptitude was too mediocre. Even if he worked hard, he wouldn't have much success in martial arts in this life. It would be the best if he could become a second-rate master. The hidden meaning of this sentence was that even if Li Yi practiced martial arts for a lifetime, he wouldn't be her opponent. In the future, he shouldn't dream of surpassing her. For martial arts, Li Yi was more of a childhood obsession. It didn't matter if he couldn't become a martial arts master. He would be very satisfied if he could become a martial arts master. Lu Rui and the others started practicing martial arts when they were young. They didn't know how much hardship they had suffered in the process to have their current strength. This kind of hardship, Li Yi might not be able to bear. In comparison, practicing Tai Chi when there was nothing to do could not only strengthen the body but also nourish the mind. It was obviously much easier. Before he finished a set of moves, Lu Rui came in from the front door. She would go outside to practice martial arts every morning. She glanced at Li Yi and saw him doing those strange moves. She imitated him, and then shook her head, and went back to her room to take a bath. "Husband, what are you doing?" After finishing the last move, a sweet voice came from behind. Li Yi turned around and saw a beautiful woman in a plain dress standing there. The dress was fluttering in the morning wind. The sun shone through her hair, illuminating the entire courtyard. Chapter 79. Even though they saw each other every day, Li Yi was still amazed by Lu Rui's beauty every time he saw her. She was as beautiful as the top actresses in the future. It was not an exaggeration to use more words to praise her beauty. In the Willow Leaf Village, Even the naughty children who hadn't even grown up knew that they would marry a wife as beautiful as Sister Rui when they grew up, which showed how attractive she was to men. It had to be said that the old Lu family's genes were so good that they had no friends. Their daughters were each more beautiful than the other. Although Li Yi had never seen Lu Rui and her sister's parents, who were his in-laws in name, he knew that the two of them were definitely not bad-looking. Sometimes, Li Yi would even think that it was a blessing from God to make up for his accidental time travel. Was the beautiful woman in front of him really his wife? Although they hadn't had sex yet, they had bowed to heaven and earth. Even though Li Yi was still a single dog, in fact, he didn't belong to this species anymore. He looked up at her and said with a smile, "This is called Tai Chi. When I was a child, I passed by an old Taoist in the village and taught me. He said that practicing Tai Chi could cultivate one's mind, strengthen one's body, and make one live to 100 years old. Do you want to learn it, my wife?" Lu Rui smiled and said, "My husband, you must be joking. Although Taoism is good at maintaining one's health, how many people have been able to live for more than 100 years since ancient times? In the stronghold, those who can live to 60 or 70 years old are already very rare. Even for martial artists like me, who have a slightly longer lifespan, living to that age is already considered very fortunate. How could I dare to hope to live to 100 years old?" Li Yi knew that what Lu Rui said was the truth. In this day and age, the medical level was extremely low. A common diarrhea or fever could kill people. The lack of hygiene awareness also made them more likely to get sick. The poor people couldn't even afford to see a doctor. If they could live to 40 or 50 years old, they would be lucky. It seemed like there was a need to teach those naughty children about hygiene. In the future, if anyone dared to urinate or defecate anywhere in the stockade village, the tools used to commit the crime would be confiscated. Lu Rui shook her head and thought that Li Yi was going to say something later. She changed the topic and said, "I've made a suit of clothes for you these days. Try it on and see if it fits you." Li Yi was slightly taken aback and was extremely surprised. Lu Rui actually made clothes for him? These days, although the two of them got along much better than before, it was not to this extent. Previously, when Lu Rui was teaching him martial arts, she was watching from the side and occasionally came up to give a few pointers. And when Li Yi was telling the story of the legend of the Condor heroes to Lu Rui and Xiao Huan, she would also quietly listen from the side, and after Li Yi was done, she would give a few comments. For example, "Inner strength is actually not that powerful. The martial arts in the book, compared to reality, are a little exaggerated," and so on, but obviously, she still liked listening to the stories that Li Yi told her. Li Yi would occasionally think about who was more powerful between the two sisters. He thought that it should be Rui, but it was not certain. If they were to fight, who would win? However, this thought had not been proven yet. But Rui was the older sister, so she should be more powerful, right? It was strange that the two sisters were born of the same mother, but their personalities were so different. Lu Rui was always cold and unapproachable, and anyone who looked at her would look like they were going to pull out a sword to kill someone. On the other hand, Lu Rui, other than being more powerful in martial arts, was more like a lady from a wealthy family. She was gentle and elegant, and would definitely be a good wife and mother in the future. If any man married her, he would be envied to death for the rest of his life. Thinking of this, even Li Yi was a little envious of himself. It was a moon-white robe. Although the fabric was ordinary, the stitches were fine. It was obvious that the person who sewed this robe had put a lot of effort into it. Before Li Yi practiced Tai Chi, he had already taken off his outer clothes. At this time he put it on and buttoned it up. The size was just right. He had a gentle and fair appearance. These days he had not neglected his training, so his body was no longer as weak as before. He could hold up the clothes. Under his scholarly appearance, there was a hint of masculinity. If he walked out with this temperament and recited a few lines, if two lovers love each other for a long time, why should they stay together day and night? Who knew how many women would go crazy for him? It fits perfectly. Thank you, my wife. A trace of undetectable emotion flashed in Li Yi's eyes as he looked at her and said. He could feel that Lu Rui no longer held the idea of using him as she had in the beginning. On the first night he was captured, Lu Rui had said that after a period of time, If he wanted to leave, he could do so at any time. Now their status in the Willow Leaf Village was no longer what it used to be. No one could force her to marry anyone. But regarding this matter, the two of them had a tacit understanding and did not mention it. In a short period of 2 months, the direct descendants of the Liu family were far more powerful than before. Even when Fang and the others faced the direct descendants, they could straighten their backs and speak loudly. "There's no need to be so polite, my husband." Lu Rui smiled and walked in front of him. She reached out and helped him with the top button of his robe. This was the first time Li looked at her at such a close distance. Her beautiful face had never been so clear before. Lu Rui finished buttoning her robe. When she raised her head, the two of them looked into each other's eyes without any preparation. They saw their own reflections in each other's eyes. The expression on Lu Rui's pretty face froze. She suddenly remembered the scene of Xiao Huan happily reciting Li Yi's poem in front of her. Thinking of what the little servant girl said yesterday, her pretty face blushed slightly, and she immediately averted her gaze. Son-in-law missed time to eat. The little servant girl walked out of the kitchen. When she saw the two figures in the courtyard, a puzzled expression suddenly appeared on her pretty face. Son-in-law and Miss, what were they doing there? Mrs. Face, why was it so red? When Li Yi was in the Willow Leaf Village, he was basically isolated from the outside world. Naturally, he did not know what was happening in Qing and Prefecture. On the day before the Mid-Autumn Poetry Meet, after a small-scale poetry meet, there were 2 Mid-Autumn Festival poems that spread at an astonishing speed. The Mid-Autumn Festival poem that was on the same level as the previous year's poetry meet quickly spread through the brothels and became known to even more people. And the Mid-Autumn Festival poem called Drinking Alone Under the Moon stunned even more people. Who knew how many scholars recited, raising a cup to invite the bright moon, facing the shadows to form 3 people, while drinking and singing. They praised this poem as the first Mid-Autumn Festival poem in history. Of course, many of the talented women were more fond of the Mid-Autumn Festival poem called Remembering Your Charming Charm. In their hearts, they felt a bit of admiration for the scholar who had yet to reveal his name. Who knew how many people hoped that the nameless scholar would appear at the Mid-Autumn Festival poetry meet today and fight for the title of the #1 scholar with Yang Yanzhou and Shen Zhao. And in the hearts of those who loved that poem, that person's poetic talent had long surpassed Yang Yanzhou and Shen Zhao. After hearing that that person was actually related to the Yining Poetry Society, within a day, the doorstep of the Poetry Society was almost trampled to pieces. Of course, regarding all of this, Li Yi was completely unaware. When he was in the kitchen preparing tonight's mid-autumn feast, he sneezed a few times and couldn't help but worry. Could it be that he caught a cold last night and caught a cold? Chapter 80. The Mid-Autumn Festival had always been a very elegant festival since ancient times. An incense burner table was set up in the courtyard, and on it were some fruits, pastries, mooncakes, snacks, and the like. 3 cups of light wine and 2 plates of side dishes would be gathered with the family, and they would toast to the moon. However, any kind of elegant atmosphere would always be destroyed when it came to Fang and the others. Even if it was as elegant as the Mid-Autumn Festival, it would also become unbearably vulgar. The sky was not dark yet, and a huge shed had been set up in the open space in front of Fang's house. Inside the shed, a huge pot was bubbling with hot steam. Fang stood on the table next to it, waving a huge spatula in his hand and stirring it with all his might. Inside the pot was half a fan of fresh pork that they had just bought today, and some spare ribs. The fragrance of the meat permeated the air, and it could be smelled from afar. Originally, they had planned to buy a whole pig, but after asking the price, Fang and the others discussed it, and they still bought half a fan of pork together. They had just gotten out of poverty, and they wanted to save as much as possible. A few naughty children lingered outside the shed, and their eyes were fixed on the big pot, and their mouths kept swallowing saliva. Inside the shed, a few men sat around the table, and there were several freshly fried side dishes on the table. They picked up the muddy wine in the bowl, and drank it all in one gulp. From time to time, there would be hearty laughter. Fang, let the wife at home take care of the meat. Come over and drink with us. A strong man put down the wine bowl, looked in Fang's direction and said loudly, "You guys drink first, I'll be right there." Fang replied, but he did not put down the huge spatula in his hand. A trace of doubt appeared on the man's face, and he muttered to himself, "What's wrong with Fang today? He usually runs faster than anyone else when he drinks, but he hasn't touched a single drop of wine today." A little further away, Fang wiped the sweat from his forehead, and he made up his mind that he would not go there tonight even if he died. Last time, he drank a bowl of wine from his son-in-law, and it made him lie in bed for a whole day. When he woke up, his head was so painful that it felt like it was going to explode. Thinking of that feeling, even though Fang was a man of indomitable spirit, he could not help but feel a little scared. He would not touch wine for a while. After a while, seeing that the meat in the pot was almost done cooking, old Fang waved his hand and called for everyone to come over. He filled everyone's bowl with a full bowl of meat soup, and naturally, there was no lack of meat. When he turned around and saw a few naughty kids pacing back and forth outside, he called out to them from afar and waved them in. Every naughty kid got a bowl of soup. We can't get involved at all, unless they agree. If Rui agrees, it will work. I'm not going to ask you to beg her. After saying this, the man flicked his sleeves and left. The middle-aged man stood there and sighed. He murmured, "I really can't bring myself to do this. Why don't I talk to second granduncle first?" Second granduncle's words, Rui should listen to him. He stood there in a daze for a long time. Just as he was about to turn around and go home, he suddenly saw the man come out of the house with something in his arms and hurriedly walk forward. "Where are you going?" The middle-aged man asked casually. "It's not easy for Rui and her sister all these years. There are still a dozen eggs left at home. I'm going to send them to them to nourish their bodies." The man's voice came from the dark night. The figure gradually walked away, leaving the middle-aged man standing there with a stunned expression, alone in the night wind. In the small courtyard, Li Yi was explaining to Xiao Huan and Sister Rui that there was no Chang'e, no osmanthus tree, no Wu Gang, and of course no jade rabbit on the moon. The courtyard they were in was hundreds of thousands of miles away from the moon. The moon itself did not emit light. The moonlight they were seeing now was actually sunlight? The little servant girl never doubted Li Yi's words. After listening to him, she was obviously a little sad that Chang'e and Jade Rabbit were not on the moon. Lu Rui had never believed that there was Chang'e and Jade Rabbit on the moon. That was something that only young girls believed in. However, she was skeptical of Li Yi's words that the moon did not emit light, and what they were seeing now was actually sunlight. It was not that she did not believe it at all. Although this sounded a little unbelievable, compared to this, Lu Rui felt that it was even more unbelievable that two rocks of different sizes would fall from the same height and land at the same time. Since such a thing could happen, what else was impossible? As for Lu Rui, she only listened quietly. Although she also had doubts in her heart, she did not ask. She patiently waited for Li Yi's explanation. Li Yi was just about to explain to them the principle of the moon reflecting sunlight when there was a sudden knock on the door. Just now it was eggs and mooncakes. What is it this time? A puzzled expression appeared on his face. He was greatly surprised. Could it be that this world had a tradition of sending warmth during the Mid-Autumn Festival? Chapter 81. Even if there was a tradition of sending warmth to the Mid-Autumn Festival in this world, it shouldn't be the direct descendants of the Lu family, who still had grudges with them. Li Yi remembered that when he first came to the village, these people didn't need to look at him directly. But just now, they deliberately flattered him, which made him feel comfortable. Since they came with gifts, Li Yi naturally could not put on a cold face. No matter what they brought, he accepted it all. And when the other party was hesitating as if he wanted to say something, he smiled and asked Xiao Huan to send them off. Li Yi naturally knew what they were thinking. Seeing that Fang and the others were living better and better lives, it would be strange if these people didn't envy them. However, if they didn't spit out all the things they ate from Sister Rui these years, there was no room for negotiation. Li Yi's attitude also made these people realize that it was impossible to get the benefits they wanted with just a few eggs, a few mooncakes, or a few words of apology. They needed to show more sincerity. For the people of the Lu family who were sad for Lu's sister Rui, there was not a moment when they regretted more than now. What they lost now was far more than what they took from the two sisters. It was not easy to popularize modern scientific knowledge to the people of this era. Some principles could be explained through simple experiments, but things that were not easy to verify were not so easy to accept. For example, whether it was Lu's sister Rui or Xiao Huan, they couldn't understand what Li Yi said. They started from Willow Village and kept walking forward, and one day they would return to the village. When Li Yi used a big ball as a metaphor for the world they lived in, even the little servant girl couldn't help laughing. "Young master, if we live on a big ball, then won't the people living below fall down?" Even the little servant girl who trusted Li Yi to the extreme couldn't understand this matter. Speaking of this, Li Yi realized that it was time to end the knowledge popularization tonight. If he continued to explain, he might have to talk about gravity or the rotation of the Earth. Was the planet under their feet called the Earth? This was something that Li Yi could not prove. But here, all the natural laws of the original world were also applicable. The sunrise and sunset, the 24 hours of the day, the 24 solar terms, and other aspects should be the same. It was somewhat similar to the parallel space theory of the future, but whether it was true or not was no longer important to him. After dinner, he walked out of the courtyard. When he reached the door, he smelled the fragrance of meat that had yet to dissipate. Fong and those fellows were too high profile. With such great fanfare, were they not afraid of attracting the wolves in the back mountain? Speaking of which, it was the night of the full moon. The possibility of this happening was very high. He had to remind Xiao Huan to close the door at night. As he thought of this, he saw a few sturdy figures walking over. Son-in-law. Fong was quite surprised to meet Li Yi and immediately greeted him. "Where are you going?" Li Yi asked curiously. "We plan to go down the mountain tonight and walk around the prefectural city," Fong replied with a smile. "It's so late, going to the prefectural city?" Li Yi was even more puzzled. Seeing Fong and the others sneaking around, the smiles on their faces seemed to reveal a sense of lasciviousness. Li Yi looked at them and said, "Could it be that you are going to a brothel?" The more he thought about it, the more he felt that it was possible. Fong looked honest, but he was always thinking about earning money to marry a mistress. He was the type of person who was extremely coquettish on the inside. But the strange thing was that he was not afraid of his wife at home today. Fong looked at Li Yi and said righteously, "Son-in-law, the prefectural city is very lively on the night of the Mid-Autumn Festival. We are just going down the mountain to take a look. Son-in-law, don't sully our innocence." Fong's words made Li Yi want to slap him. He was clearly uncultured, but he still wanted to learn from scholars and speak in a genteel manner. Yet he always expressed the wrong meaning, sully his innocence. This scene stung his eyes just thinking about it. Moreover, where did this guy get his innocence from? We are all men, so I can understand. But this kind of thing needs to be restrained. Don't be carried out of the jade yard tomorrow. Although Fong looked like a dragon and a tiger, who knew if he was as strong as he looked in that aspect? Li Yi kindly reminded him, "Son-in-law, how do you know about the jade yard?" Fong looked at Li Yi and asked with a puzzled expression. Li Yi was stunned for a moment, then a smile appeared on his face. He looked up at the sky and couldn't help but exclaim, "The moon tonight is not bad. The moon is so big and round." Fong, after being stunned for a moment, he could only laugh dryly and say, "Yes, the moon is so big and round today." He sighed with emotion at the mid-autumn moon, and suddenly felt a surge of talent in his heart. He almost wanted to recite a poem, but Fong stopped himself in time. He turned to look at Li Yi and said, "Son-in-law, do you want to go down with us to take a look? The busiest days of the year in the prefectural city are the mid-autumn and the upper prime period. Don't worry if you want to go to the jade yard. We will definitely not tell eldest miss when we come back." Fong and the others looked at each other and revealed a smile that all men understood. To be honest, Li Yi was really moved by Fong's words. In this era, one couldn't watch TV or watch movies, or even play with mobile phones. There was really no entertainment to pass the time. It was even more so in the stockade outside the prefectural city. After dark, people could only go to bed early. Li Yi was very curious about what the nightlife of the people in the city was like. On account of old Fang's sincere invitation, he reluctantly accompanied them for a stroll. Of course, it was fine to go to the Jade Yard. It was the first time in 2 lifetimes, and he couldn't give it away so carelessly. Moreover, he and Zheng Zimo were considered acquaintances. If he ran into her, how awkward would it be? He could consider going to other brothels. Under the condition of keeping his bottom line, he could properly experience the ancient culture. Going out with Fang and the others in the middle of the night, his sense of security suddenly increased a lot. He was about to go back and say hello to Lu Rui and the others, but when he turned around, he found that the woman with the sword was leaning against a willow tree behind him, looking at them with interest. "Hello, second miss." Fang had an extremely simple and honest expression on his face. He greeted Lu Rui, but there was a trace of an imperceptible smirk at the corner of his mouth. Seeing his sister-in-law behind him, Li Yi suddenly had a few black lines on his face. He had actually been tricked by this idiot Fang. He must have remembered that he had been beaten up by his sister-in-law 2 times before. He had already seen Lu Rui just now and deliberately said those words to lure him. Was this still the King simple and honest Fang? Chapter 82. After seeing the Qing and Prefecture City on the night of the Mid-Autumn Festival, Li Yi finally understood that Fang was right. Before this, he had never thought that the nightlife of the ancient people could be so rich. The streets of the Qing and Prefecture City were as lively as the extremely prosperous night markets of the later generations. The entire street was brightly lit, and the main street, which was several feet wide, was unusually crowded. It was difficult for carriages and horses to move. There was an endless stream of pedestrians, and hawkers with their shoulders on their shoulders came and went. All kinds of hawking sounds could be heard. After walking for a short distance, Li Yi already saw a few hawkers selling candied haws. Their business was unusually good. If Fang and the others saw this, they would probably die of heartache. Tonight's business was probably equivalent to 10 days or half a month's worth of business. Thinking of Fang, Li Yi couldn't help but feel a few black lines appear on his face. Men become bad when they become rich. This saying was used in both ancient and modern times. Now that Fang's wallet was bulging, even his personality had changed a lot. Who knew where the honest man who couldn't bear to eat the pheasant he hunted and wanted to give it to Lu's sister Rui had gone? In such a short period of time, he had become a sinister, cunning, and shameless person. Li Yi turned to look at Rui, who was following him and looking at the night market with interest. In his heart, he had already made up his mind to let Fang do the most difficult and tiring work for a period of time in the future. If it wasn't for Fang, the current him would probably be free and unfettered. Perhaps he could really go to a brothel and experience the splendid culture of the ancient times. Of course, this was just an assumption. Although it was a little exciting to bring his sister-in-law to a brothel, before this, Li Yi couldn't guarantee that Lu Rui wouldn't put his sword in a wrong place. Fang and the others were clever. The moment they entered the prefecture city, they found an excuse to slip away, leaving this big trouble to Li Yi. Of course, Li Yi also rejected this in his heart. However, ever since they entered the city, Lu Rui had been following behind him without any intention of leaving. He couldn't get rid of him no matter what. "Rui, why don't I give you a few taels of silver, and you can walk around by yourself?" The feeling of being watched by others did not feel good. Li Yi finally could not hold it in any longer. He turned his head to look at Lu Rui and gave a very constructive suggestion. Lu Rui turned her head to look at him. There was no expression on her face, nor did she speak. However, the look in her eyes made Li Yi feel a little diffident. Moments later, Li Yi waved his hand helplessly. "Forget it. Follow me if you want to." With such a tough sister-in-law around, it would be impossible to experience the brothel culture with a learning attitude. Li Yi gave up on this idea and walked along the street in boredom. Only the street sideshow could pique his interest. Just when he was about to go over to take a look, someone suddenly patted his back. Li Yi turned his head and was slightly taken aback. A look of surprise appeared on his face. "Brother Li, it's really you." Seeing Li Yi here, the handsome young man opposite him was also very surprised and said with a slightly surprised tone, "Little. Haha, Brother Li, what a coincidence." Li Yi didn't expect to meet the little prince of Ningguang Mansion here. He had just said one word when he remembered that he had told others not to call him that, so he changed his words. This lady is Brother Li's wife? The little prince, Li Xian, looked around and saw Lu Rui standing at the side. A trace of surprise flashed in his eyes, and he blurted out, "No, Brother Li has misunderstood. This is my wife's sister." Li Yi immediately explained. Whoever married Lu Rui was really tired of living. He wasn't that stupid. Wife's sister. Li Xian heard it, and was stunned at first. Then, a strange smile appeared on his face. He looked at Li Yi with a look that all men understood. He then patted his shoulder and said, "Brother Li is really capable. I admire you." Li Yi was stunned for a while before he understood Li Xian's meaning. When he looked at him again, the look in his eyes changed. This guy, is he really a little prince? Or were all the little princes of ancient times this kind of filthy people? Lu Rui didn't understand Li Xian's words at first. But seeing the expression on his face, she seemed to have thought of something. Her pretty face turned cold, and one hand was already on the hilt of her sword. A faint murderous aura emanated from her delicate body. At the same time, the expressions of the two men dressed as manservants standing behind Li Xian suddenly changed. They took a step forward and stood in front of Li Xian, reaching for their waists. "What are you doing?" Li Xian looked at the two people who suddenly became nervous and asked in confusion. The murderous aura collided and swords were drawn. Seeing this, Li Yi's heart skipped a beat. This little prince could flirt with anyone, but he actually flirted with this demoness. If he really angered her, she would chop him like a tree trunk. That night in Qing Prefecture would be very lively. From then on, he could only flee to the ends of the world with the two sisters and Xiao Huan. They would find a hidden place to hide for the rest of their lives. The three of them would live together. Thinking about it, this kind of life seemed to be quite happy. No, if they ran away, Fong and all the people in Willow Leaf Village would not be able to run away. At that time, they might become the scapegoats. After all, murder was a serious crime, not to mention that it was a relative of the emperor. The consequences of this sword were too serious. Before Lu Rui drew out her sword, Li Yi quickly pressed her hand. "Don't be impulsive, don't be impulsive. We are all on the same side." Lu Rui's delicate body shook. She looked down at the hand held by Li Yi, and her eyes emitted a dangerous aura again. At this time, the way Li Xian looked at Li Yi was even more different. Although they all had the surname Li, this brother Li's behavior was obviously more eccentric. He had touched his sister-in-law's hand in the street, and he still said that there was no adultery between them? But this matter was soon forgotten by him. He pulled Li Yi's sleeve and said, "Let's not talk about this first. Let's go, I will take you to a fun place." Hearing Li Xian said fun place, Li Yi immediately thought of something. He looked serious and said righteously, "Brother Li, who do you think I am? How can I go to that kind of place of prostitution?" When he spoke, he secretly glanced at Lu Rui, and the awe-inspiring qi on his body became stronger. "Brother Li, you misunderstood. This time we are not going to the Jade Yard. You will know the specific place in a while." Li Xian explained. Alas, what a stupid teammate. Feeling two cold eyes falling on his back, Li Yi sighed in his heart, and thought with great melancholy. He had been cheated twice in a row. He was afraid that he could no longer avoid going to the Jade Yard. Chapter 83. The lights that lit up the entire night reflected the extreme prosperity of the prefectural city on the night of mid-autumn. No matter where one went, there was a bustling and noisy atmosphere. Somewhere in the bustling area of the city, there was a vast and luxurious manor. Scholars and scholars with feather fans and silk handkerchiefs floated in the wind. As they chatted and laughed, new poems flowed out. After a few paper rafts were sent out, not long after, there were professional singers in the garden. Very quickly, they would sing the poem in a mellow voice, and leave it for everyone to judge. On the opposite side there were all women. They were all the daughters of the large families in the prefectural city. Occasionally, they would sneak a glance across and cover their handkerchiefs with a light smile. They would sneak a glance at the scholars they liked. If a paper raft with a poem was sent over, A few of them would gather together and comment on it. As the daughters of families with a bit of status in the city, they generally knew a bit of poetry. At this time, in a pavilion in a remote corner of the garden, the atmosphere was slightly cold. A young girl of 16 or 17 sat at a stone table in the pavilion, with one hand propping up her chin. She looked at the figures coming and going in front of her. Her expression was a bit bored. After a while, she turned her head and said to the women in the pavilion, "This mid-autumn poetry meet is not fun at all." Hearing this, the women looked at each other speechlessly. Today, this garden was hosting the mid-autumn poetry meet, not the mid-autumn temple fair. Even if they randomly stopped anyone on the road, they could be a famous scholar in Qing Prefecture. Everyone was here to exchange pointers and make friends through literature, not to have fun. If a scholar was not famous enough, he wouldn't even have the right to participate in the poetry meet. This invitation from the Yunying Poetry Society had been obtained after many twists and turns. "Sister Yunro, is the scholar you were talking about coming tonight?" The young girl who spoke was not a member of the Yunying Poetry Society. She had only asked Zhao Yunru to bring her to watch because there was an extra invitation. However, reality was different from what she had imagined. This mid-autumn poetry meet was not as fun as she had imagined. She asked Zhao Yunru, still thinking about a certain scholar that her sisters could not forget. Zhao Yunru shook her head with a bitter smile. They never had much hope that they would be able to see Li Yi from the immortal Magpie Bridge here. Participating in this kind of poetry gathering was probably just an opportunity to broaden their horizons. As expected, the young master from yesterday did not come today, one of the young girls in the pavilion said. Putting aside the scholar who only existed in legends, the nameless scholar who had helped them qualify for the poetry meet yesterday was not seen either. That young master must really be indifferent to fame and fortune. He didn't even accept the invitation yesterday. It seems that he has no interest in this poetry meet, Wan Ruoqing said after thinking for a while. Until now, she still felt a little regretful that she had forgotten to ask for the young master's name yesterday. With the other's talent in poetry, he was definitely not a nameless person in Qing and Fu. However, after Wan Ruoqing investigated each and every one of the scholars who were worthy of that level of talent, she still did not find any. He was like Li Yi of Immortal Magpie Bridge. He had only left behind poems, but he was nowhere to be seen. This caused countless scholars to daydream. If he could come, perhaps things would not be so boring right now. At least in name, he was still a member of the Yunying Poetry Society. In today's poetry meet, the position of the Yunying Poetry Society was actually quite awkward. Even though they all had the reputation of being talented, there was still a large gap between them and the upper-class scholars. They had no way of fitting into their circle. Even the prefectural magistrate of Qing Prefecture would make a brief appearance at the poetry meet, much less the first and second scholars. In the past, they would never have had the chance to interact with these people. Even the most famous of them all, Wan Ruoqing, only had the reputation of being a talented woman in a small circle. Tonight's mid-autumn poetry meet was of a much higher standard. Even their seats were arranged to be in such a remote place. And in the center of the garden was a waterside pavilion. Many famous scholars gathered there. This was the true heart of the poetry meet. All the masterpieces that appeared in the poetry meet would eventually be gathered here. The people who commented here were all extremely important scholars, or people of virtue and prestige, or people of high status. Of course, the poetry meet did not only consist of reciting poems. Singers and dancers could be seen everywhere. Their voices were melodious, and their movements were moving. Most of what they sang was the work that had appeared tonight. If there was a good piece, it would quickly be sent out of the garden. Before long, people in the brothels of the city would receive the news and sing out the new work. Ordinary scholars who did not have the right to enter the meet would mostly gather at such a place. They would not miss out on the works of the meet. Poetry meets of all sizes were not rare in the prefectural city tonight. If there were a few outstanding works, they could be sent to the garden to be judged alongside the works of the scholars. Of course, a masterpiece of this level was extremely rare and hard to come by every year. An elegant atmosphere spread throughout the city. At this time, the Mid-Autumn Poetry Meet was already halfway through. Qin Yang's performance tonight was average. Even though it was average, there was not much that stood out. It is indeed surprising. Husband Qin's Mid-Autumn Poetry is not bad. Last year it was in the top 10. I'm afraid it will be difficult to make it today. Chen Yui's poem is not bad. The idea is new and unexpected. It can be considered a rare piece of work. Not bad. With his standard in the past, to be able to write a poem of this level is already very rare. In the middle of the waterside pavilion, in a much wider pavilion, a few scholars were evaluating the poems of the night. They were all scholars that were well known in Qing'an Prefecture. Although their opinions did not represent authority, they still had great value as a reference. Beside them, a slender figure leaned against the railing by the water. He held a wine cup in his hand and raised his head to look at the bright moon in the sky. He drank the wine in the cup in one gulp. He couldn't help but murmur, "I raise my cup to invite the bright moon. The shadow becomes 3 people. What's wrong with Brother Yanzhou today? Why isn't he saying anything?" One of the scholars raised his head and looked in a certain direction. A trace of confusion flashed across his face. The other was publicly recognized as the #1 scholar of Qing'an. His poetry was flourishing, and few could compare. Other than Shen Zhao, who could compete with him for the title of champion of the meet, there was no one else who could rival him. Even Shen Zhao could not compare to Yang Yanzhou in terms of mid-autumn poetry. Although he had not yet produced a poem, he had more or less secured the title of champion. But looking at it now, he did not seem to be in high spirits. Chapter 84. Of course, these people did not know that after seeing the 2 poems that had spread like wildfire through the prefectural city yesterday, Yang Yanzhou did not have much anticipation for today's poetry conference. He was the publicly recognized #1 scholar in Qing'an Prefecture. When it came to poetry, he naturally had unparalleled confidence. But this confidence had been shaken yesterday. That, remembering your charming maiden, was all right. Although it could be considered a good poem, he still had the confidence to come up with a better one. But that drinking alone under the moon, that raising a cup to invite the bright moon, the shadow becomes 3 people. Even he was truly shocked. Yang Yanzhou's poems were very popular in Qing'an Prefecture, but in reality, he was also very accomplished in poetry. Reading this poem for the first time, it gave him the feeling that he was reading a famous poem left behind by someone before him. He could not bring himself to compare it at all. A similar feeling had appeared a month ago. The first time he heard that Immortal of the Magpie Bridge, Yang Yanzhou was at the Qixi Poetry Conference. He had just written down the first line of his poem, and after that, he could not write any more. With pearls and jade in front of him, as the #1 scholar, if Yang Yanzhou's poem could not surpass that Immortal of the Magpie Bridge, then he might as well not compose it. Shen Zhao, on the other hand, was even more unlucky. His Qixi poem had already received the unanimous praise of the crowd, but when it came to the line, if the love between 2 could last forever, why would it be day and night? It was like a firefly compared to the bright moon. It was instantly overshadowed, and no one paid attention to it. After that, Shen Zhao tore that proud poem to shreds in anger, and publicly announced that he would no longer compose Qixi poems. Although Yang Yanzhou had not said anything similar, if he did compose Qixi poems in the future, it would only be for his own amusement. He would not bring it out for others to comment on. Not only for the 2 of them, but for the literary world in the future, Qixi poems would be a taboo that the scholars would not lightly touch. After that night, although Yang Yanzhou wanted to get to know the scholar who had written Immortal of the Magpie Bridge, he never got to meet him. Now he still felt quite regretful. After the incident, there were people who mentioned that person to him and Shen Zhao. There was a faint sense that he was being praised as the foremost scholar of Qing'an. Yang Yanzhou did not care much about this. A poem on the Qixi festival could not prove anything. Some mediocre poets could occasionally produce something that would shock people. For Yang Yanzhou to be recognized by so many people, he naturally had some ability. He wouldn't feel that he was weaker than that person. However, no matter what, such a person was already worth getting to know. Just as he was thinking about these things, a person was already walking over from not too far away. Hearing the approaching footsteps, Yang Yinzhou turned his head and saw a young scholar walking over. Brother Wan. The other party was also an extremely famous scholar in Qing'an Prefecture. Yang Yinzhou raised his hands in greeting to him. After the other party returned the greeting, he asked curiously, I saw Brother Yinzhou drinking by yourself for a long time just now. Is there something on your mind? Yang Yinzhou smiled and said, Thank you for your concern, Brother Wan. Yinzhou has nothing on my mind. Is it because none of the masterpieces of the scholars tonight were able to catch Brother Yinzhou's eyes? The scholar smiled and said somewhat mockingly, That's true. Brother Wan is the foremost scholar of Qing'an Prefecture. Your mind is filled with countless ravines. I'm afraid the works that we are proud of, in your eyes, are extremely mediocre. Yang Yinzhou knew that he was teasing him. Hearing this, he only smiled and didn't speak. At this time, the scholar opened his mouth again and said, Yesterday's drinking alone under the moon, and remembering your charm. Brother Yinzhou, have you heard of them? Hearing this, Yang Yinzhou nodded and said, Today, the entire Qing'an Prefecture is discussing this matter. How could I not know such masterpieces? This is also the first time I've heard of the Yunying Poetry Society. I didn't know that there were so many hidden talents in such a small poetry society. I heard that the talented women of the Yunying Poetry Society are also here. Brother Yinzhou, do you want to come with me to pay a visit? The scholar looked at him and smiled. I've heard that these two poems weren't written by women. But since they are related to the Yunying Poetry Society, let's go together. Yang Yinzhou nodded. The two of them laughed and chatted as they walked out of the water pavilion in the middle, and walked in a certain direction. Look, isn't that? That's Master Yang, he's walking over here. Ah, he's the foremost scholar of Qing'an Prefecture, Yang Yinzhou. He's coming. Is Master Yang coming to our place? Yang Yinzhou's name was extremely famous in Qing'an Prefecture. As the person with the most attention tonight, no matter where he went, he was destined to be the focus of everyone's attention. Tonight he hadn't written a poem yet. Who knew how many people's gazes were on him? Especially those women who admired his talent. Their beautiful eyes lit up, and they paid attention to his every move at all times. It immediately caused quite a bit of an uproar. In the pavilion in the corner, the women of the Yunying Poetry Society passed around the excellent works that had been circulated tonight. Occasionally, they would whisper to each other. Their pretty faces were faintly filled with envy. Wan Ruoqing copied down the poem she liked. Zheng Zimo leaned on her shoulder and stared dazedly in a certain direction. She appeared to be somewhat dispirited. She actually wasn't that interested in this poetry gathering. She only thought that if she could meet Li Yi here, she would definitely ask him what kind of technique he used to paint that painting to be so lifelike. However, until now there was still no news. Although she felt regretful, she also realized that that person probably wouldn't come. Her eyes inadvertently glanced, and there seemed to be a graceful figure flashing by. A beautiful face appeared in front of Zheng Zimo's eyes. After being stunned for a moment, she suddenly stood up. What is it? This sudden movement startled Wan Ruoqing. She hurriedly stopped writing and looked at her, asking with concern. It's her. I saw her just now. Zheng Zimo's pretty face was full of excitement. Her gaze swept around anxiously, but she couldn't find the figure that had been engraved in the depths of her mind. Who did you see? Wan Ruoqing asked with confusion. The woman in the painting. I really saw her just now. The figure flashed by and immediately disappeared. Zheng Zimo's tone became a bit anxious. What? You saw the woman in the painting? Where? Wan Ruoqing heard this and was slightly stunned. She immediately stood up and looked at her. Over there. Zheng Zimo pointed in a certain direction and said, She was there just now, but in the blink of an eye, I couldn't see her. Could it be wrong? Wan Ruoqing asked with some uncertainty. I can't be wrong, Zheng Zimo said with certainty. These days, she had been copying the painting every day. The appearance of the beautiful woman had already been engraved in her mind. How could she be wrong? As long as she could find the woman, she would naturally be able to find the person who painted the painting, the talent named Li Yi. Zheng Zima was anxious, and was about to go search when a few figures walked over from not far away. As those people got closer, the surrounding atmosphere seemed to become a little strange. At this time, somewhere in the garden. "May I ask for your name?" Li Xian smiled as he looked at the beautiful woman before him in a refined and courteous manner. Lu Rui shot him a nonchalant glance as she coldly spat out a single word. Scram. Chapter 85. Looking at Li Xian retreating with his tail between his legs, Li started to doubt again. Is this guy really a little prince? How could a relative of the imperial family behave in such a way? Who could be more cowardly than him? After all, he was a little prince. How could he tolerate being humiliated by a woman in front of him? If it was someone else, even if she was a woman, they would have given her a tight slap. How dare you insult a relative of the imperial family? Let's teach her a lesson first. Of course, if Li Xian really did that, he would not be able to stand here and talk to Li Yi unscathed. As for Li Yi, he needed to make some preparations to escape with Xiao Huan and Sister Rui. The two men behind Li Xian looked at Lu Rui angrily, but they did not dare to act rashly. Although the woman in front of them was young, she gave them a lot of pressure. Fortunately, although her words to the little prince were a little harsh, it seemed that she would not do anything unfavorable. So the two of them were slightly relieved. Then, the two of them could not help but look at the familiar young man in front of them. If it wasn't for him, Wang Fei would probably still be suffering from her illness. The illness that even the imperial doctors could not do anything about had been easily solved by him. Wang Yu was very happy. He had been sending people to search for her these past few days. He would probably be rewarded handsomely. Thinking that this person was about the same age as the little prince, but he had such abilities, the two of them were very surprised. Brother Li's wife's sister, her temperament, is a little special, Li Xian said to Li Yi with a dry laugh after being chased away by Lu Rui. Lu Rui's temperament could not be described with just the word special. She was a heroine who would draw her sword and cut people at the slightest disagreement. Obviously, this little prince had not realized what was truly special about her. So this is the fun place that Brother Li mentioned. Li Yi smiled awkwardly and changed the topic. Only now did she realize that the place Li Xian was talking about wasn't a brothel. She was a little disappointed. The atmosphere in the garden looked very elegant. There were scholars and beautiful women, dancers and singers, and people who recited poems and admired the moon. It was very lively. Upon hearing this, Li Xian waved his hand and said, "Calling me brotherly sounds too distant. I owe you a favor, so you don't need to care about these formalities. You and I can just call each other by name." Although this little prince looked very unreliable, his temperament and nature were very much to Li Yi's liking. If the other party really put on airs in front of him as a little prince, Li Yi would not be too close to him. After all, although he lived in ancient times, he had lived in the 21st century for a long time. He still had some conflict with the ancient concept of hierarchy. Although when in Rome, do as the Romans do, in front of people of the same age, Li Yi did not want to always appear inferior. It was better to try his best to avoid interacting with these so-called big shots. A small willow leaf village was enough for him to deal with. Li Xian patted his shoulder and said, "You might not know this, but this year's Mid-Autumn Poetry Meet will be held in Mianxiu Garden. You can randomly point to anyone, and they will be famous scholars. Those talented girls in the prefectural city, or the ladies from the noble families who admire their talent and learning will all be here. Even a few famous prostitutes from the brothels have been invited. If they can write a good poem and suppress the first and second scholars, maybe they will also be favored by them." A dream in a spring night. Li Xian talked nonstop on the side. The dignified little prince of Ningguang Fu was talking about these things with a serious face. Those who didn't know would think that the two of them were discussing poetry. At the very least, Li Yi could see a few women walking past them. Their gazes lingered on them for a long time, and when they walked past them, they would even turn around to look at them. He could vaguely hear them giggling while covering their mouths, saying that the two young masters were really handsome. This was the truth. After Li Yi transmigrated, he was most satisfied with the appearance of this body. No matter how he looked at it, It was extremely handsome. Otherwise, Lu Rui would not have fallen for him at first sight, right? Although this little prince was a playboy and did not do proper things, there was nothing to say about his appearance. If he was placed in the future, he would belong to the type that did not need to rely on talent or family power. He could only rely on his face to make a living. It should be known that those lonely middle-aged rich women liked this type of pretty boy the most. It was unknown where Lu Rui had gone. Li Xian led Li Yi to wander around the garden. From time to time, he would point at a girl and introduce her from afar. This was a famous talented girl in Qing'anfu. This was a top artist in some brothel. This was a daughter of some family. He was even more familiar with the slightly more beautiful girls. This made Li Yi wonder if this little prince had some kind of hobby. After all, with his background, what kind of girl couldn't he get? Why did he have to hide his identity and pretend to be an ordinary person? Why did he have to go to the jadeite courtyard and listen to songs all day? Or maybe the other party's realm was far higher than his, and this was just his attitude towards life. He was originally a member of the royal family, but he hid in the mortal world, playing in the mortal world, passing through thousands of flowers, not a single leaf touching him. However, no matter how he looked at it, he didn't seem like an expert with this kind of awareness. The environment in Mianxiu Garden was indeed much better than the outside. Putting aside the talented girls and rich young ladies, at least the singing and dancing here was quite good. And the taste of the wine and pastries was not bad. Just now Li Xian said this was some mid-autumn poetry meet. He didn't know if it was the same as what Wan Ruoqing and the others had said yesterday. In any case, he hadn't seen them here yet. It had to be said that the ancients really had too much free time. They didn't find it annoying even if they held poetry meets all day. However, he didn't see how much they cared about industry. It was meaningless to do these things. Just as the two of them were walking toward the most lively water pavilion, in another remote corner of the garden, Wan Ruoqing and a few women from the Yunying Poetry Society stood up. Zheng Zimo, who had wanted to find the girl in the painting, had to stop as well. A few figures walked over from the front and blocked her path. Are you the talented girls from the Yunying Poetry Society? The young man walking in front clasped his hands at them and said with a smile. Zhao Yunru walked out and looked at the seemingly familiar man. She asked with some confusion. We don't dare to call ourselves talented girls. Sir, you are. The young man smiled. When he opened his mouth again, a voice traveled over. This one is Shen Zhao. The women, including Zhao Yunru, were stunned for a moment. Then they couldn't help but cry out. Chapter 86. The name of Shen Zhao was not unfamiliar to Zhao Yunru and the women of the Yunying Poetry Society. He was a renowned talent in Qing'an Prefecture. Although he had always been suppressed by Yang Yanzhou and could only be number 2 for 1,000 years, in the eyes of others, his talent was still boundlessly high. The girls covered their mouths and exclaimed softly. Although they were known as talented women, Shen Zhao and Yang Yanzhou were still existences that they had to look up to in their hearts. To a certain extent, they were no different from those girls who admired their talents. So it is young Master Shen. Just now, I read young Master Shen's poems. Young Master is brimming with talent. I am filled with admiration. Shen Zhao had already composed a mid-autumn festival poem. Zhao Yunru and the women of the Yunying Poetry Society had already seen it. As the president of the Poetry Society, although Zhao Yunru was surprised that Shen Zhao had come to speak with them, she still bowed politely and spoke with a smile. Miss, you are too kind. I am not worthy of such praise. Shen Zhao raised his hands in a salute, and then looked at her. Not to mention that drinking alone under the moon, even the remembering you're charming, that your society took out yesterday is something that I cannot compare to. Hearing this, Zhao Yunru's expression froze slightly as if she hadn't expected Shen Zhao to suddenly say such a thing. For a moment, she didn't know how to respond. Just at this time, she heard Shen Zhao ask again. I wonder if the talent who wrote Raising a Cup to the Bright Moon, The Shadow Becomes 3 People is here tonight? Hearing this, Zhao Yunru finally understood that this was Shen Zhao's purpose in coming. She said somewhat apologetically. To be honest, that young master is not here tonight. That is a bit of a pity. Shen Zhao's expression was somewhat disappointed. If those two excellent poems were taken out tonight, there would be no doubt that they would become the champion of the Mid-Autumn Festival. I don't think so. The poem that Brother Shen wrote tonight is also the pinnacle of Mid-Autumn Festival poems. It may not be any weaker than those two. Yes, that Remembering You're Charming is too sentimental. In my opinion, it cannot compare to Brother Shen. Although Drinking Alone Under the Moon is good, it is not a poem. There is no need to compare. When Shen Zhao walked over, there were already many people following him. At this moment, when one of them spoke, everyone immediately agreed. Being praised by so many people, Shen Zhao was naturally very happy in his heart. Although he modestly declined a few words, his face was still slightly proud. For today's poetry meet, he had already composed a poem for the Mid-Autumn Festival a few months ago. After many months of polishing and deliberating, he finally finalized it not long ago. He was extremely satisfied with the standard of this poem. He wanted to suppress Yang Yanzhou in the Mid-Autumn Festival poetry meet, and also release the resentment that had been suppressed by him for a long time. But no matter how he calculated, he did not expect that on the day before the Mid-Autumn poetry meet, a dark horse would suddenly appear. Those two Mid-Autumn poems were thrown out, and even he was stunned. Shen Zhao was good at writing lyrics, not good at composing poems. He didn't have much of an impression of Drinking Alone Under the Moon, but the standard of Remembering You're Charming was comparable to the Mid-Autumn Festival poem he had prepared. If the two were to be compared at the same poetry meet, even someone as confident as Shen Zhao couldn't guarantee that he would win. Fortunately, that poem was taken out before the Mid-Autumn Festival poetry meet. Naturally, it could not participate in tonight's selection. Otherwise, before he could compete with Yang Yanzhou, he might be defeated by that poem. Of course, this was not entirely a bad thing. At least from Shen Zhao's point of view, that person would not be able to produce a poem of that level in a short period of time. But that person's reputation was already known by everyone. If he could suppress that person tonight, it would probably greatly increase his own reputation. At that time, if he could defeat Yang Yanzhou, perhaps the title of the #1 scholar in Qing'an Prefecture would fall onto Shen Zhao's head. Just now, he had sought out the Yunying Poetry Society with such thoughts in mind. But what he didn't expect was that that person would not participate in tonight's poetry meet. He couldn't help but feel a bit disappointed. Zhao Yunru listened to the flattering words of those people, and didn't know what to say. It was common for scholars to flatter each other. But even though Shen Zhao's reputation was there, in Zhao Yunru's heart, the talent of that gentleman yesterday was already on the same level as Shen Zhao and Yang Yanzhou. Although that person isn't here tonight, Miss Wan of the Yunying Poetry Club is also extraordinarily talented. Even men like us are ashamed of ourselves. I wonder what masterpiece Miss Wan will have tonight. At this moment, a voice suddenly came from the crowd. Seeing the man walk out from the crowd, the expressions of Zhao Yunru and the women of the Yunying Poetry Society changed slightly. Su Wentian. Even though they didn't know why he was here, it was clear that he did not have good intentions. Everyone present was somewhat familiar with the name Wan Ruoqing. After all, Qing'an Prefecture was so big. Even though there were many scholars, there were only a few talented women who could be named. Naturally, everyone was familiar with them. This was the first time Shen Zhao had heard of this. He was extremely famous for his talent, and had no interest in those who were not as famous as him. My talent is mediocre and naturally cannot compare to the scholars here. It's just a humble piece of work, so I won't embarrass myself, Wan Ruoqing said faintly. Her attitude was extremely humble. Miss Wan, there is no need to be so humble. The poem you took out that day, Immortal of the Magpie Bridge, is something that we will never be able to match in our lifetime. Su Wentian's face was still full of smiles. As he spoke, his eyes inadvertently glanced at Shen Zhao. As expected, after hearing the three words Immortal of the Magpie Bridge, Shen Zhao's expression did not look too good. That day, because of this poem, in a moment of impulse, he personally tore up his proud work and swore that he would never compose Qixi poems again. After thinking about it, he regretted it greatly. But with his status, since he had already said it, he naturally could not take it back. However, Every time he thought about it, he felt very uncomfortable. Now that Su Wentian mentioned it, it brought back some bad memories. But wasn't that poem written by a scholar named Li Yi? What does it have to do with the woman in front of him? That Immortal of the Magpie Bridge. Was it really written by you? Xin Zhao looked at her and asked in shock. Young Master Xin, you misunderstand. Immortal of the Magpie Bridge was indeed written by a scholar named Li Yi. I merely saw it by coincidence, Wan Ruoqing explained. Haha, the story of the Sky Prayer Lantern is too outrageous. I don't believe it. Before Xin Zhao could speak, Su Wentian shook his head and said, let's not talk about this for now. You have the reputation of being a talented woman. A mere Mid-Autumn Festival poem. I'm afraid you can easily compose it. Are you looking down on the scholars here? That day at the Qixi poetry meet, Su Wentian was there. Of course, he knew that the poem was not written by Wan Ruoqing. But after what happened yesterday, Su Wentian's reputation was completely ruined. He hated the Yining Poetry Society to the extreme. He had gone through so much to obtain the right to attend today's meet. If he didn't embarrass them in front of everyone, he would not be able to swallow this anger. At this moment, Shen Zhao pondered for a moment and finally spoke. This brother's words make sense. The purpose of today's poetry meet is to exchange pointers and make friends through literature. If you still refuse, then you are really looking down on us. When Su Wentian spoke, Shen Zhao already had a trace of suspicion in his heart. Now he went along with his words. Whether or not this woman had that kind of poetic talent, after she composes a poem, he would naturally know. Brother Shen's words make sense. Yes, you don't have to decline anymore. We also want to see the poetic talent of the talented lady of Qingyan Fu. With Shen Zhao as the leader, the people present all agreed. Seeing this, the expressions on Zhao Yunro and the women of the Yining Poetry Society became ugly. Exchanging pointers was voluntary. Forcing someone to compose a poem had never been heard of. Shen Zhao and the others were bullying people by doing this. Wan Ruoqing had a difficult expression. It wasn't that she couldn't compose a Mid-Autumn Festival poem, but her improvisation was only average. Su Wentian would definitely use this as a pretext. This was something she didn't want to see. Su Wentian saw the expressions of Wan Ruoqing and the women of the Yining Poetry Society. A trace of mockery rose to the corner of his mouth. So what if I look down on you? So many men bullying a weak woman. You are shameless to the extreme. At this time, a voice clearly traveled into everyone's ears. There was a moment of silence. Then, anger rose to the faces of several people. They all turned their heads and looked in the direction of the voice. Under the moonlight, the white-clothed woman stood there with her sword and looked coldly at them. Chapter 87. Who are you? What did you mean by that? At the poetry meet, exchanging pointers is a common thing. How is it shameless? If you don't give us an explanation today, I'm afraid we won't agree. Hearing that voice, all the scholars turned to look at the white-clothed girl standing there, their faces full of anger. To these proud and arrogant scholars, face was undoubtedly extremely important. To be called shameless by a woman, how could they tolerate it? If it wasn't for the fact that this girl was extremely beautiful, and they still had some pity in their hearts, it wouldn't have been as simple as a few questions. Xin Zhao's face darkened as well. As the second scholar of Qingyan Prefecture, forcing a girl to compose a poem was indeed inappropriate. But he was used to being high and mighty. No matter what he said or what he did, countless people would agree. As for whether it was appropriate or inappropriate, Xin Zhao didn't care. But for someone to point it out like this, it was clearly not giving him face. Xin Zhao's eyes were cold. He looked at her and said, even though the scale of today's Mid-Autumn Poetry meet is large, there are even more scholars in the prefectural city. I don't know how many scholars will not be able to participate. Since the talented women of the Yining Poetry Society have been invited to participate, your talents must be exceptional. If you can't come up with a decent poem, isn't that a bit unreasonable? Shameless is shameless. No matter how many excuses you find, it's still shameless. The woman's expression was still as cold as ever. she said bluntly. Your literary talent isn't that great, but your skin is quite thick. You're making things difficult for a woman. Not to mention a genius. I'm afraid you're not even a man. As the top scholar of Qing and Prefecture, he was actually questioned by a girl about his literary talent, and whether he was a man. No matter how good Shen Zhao's composure was, he almost couldn't control the anger in his heart. It took a long time for him to calm down. This girl's words also made these scholars speechless. To make things difficult for a girl like this, it was indeed disgraceful. But she actually said that Shen Zhao's literary talent wasn't that great. Perhaps even Yang Yanzhou wouldn't dare to say such a thing? It seemed that this woman did not know that the person standing in front of her was the second most talented scholar of Qing'an Prefecture, Shen Zhao. Ruoqing and Zheng Zimo had no idea what these people were thinking. The two girls stared blankly at the woman holding the sword. They were extremely familiar with that beautiful face. It was exactly the same as the one in the painting. Please forgive me for my poor eyesight, but I wonder where you are from? Shen Zhao looked at the woman aggressively, anger clearly visible on his face. Since you look down on me, you must be much more talented than me. Why don't we compete during this poetry meet? If you can come up with a poem that surpasses me, I'll accept it wholeheartedly. Otherwise, I hope you can give me an explanation for today's matter. When Shen Zhao said those words, it was obvious that he wanted to challenge him. The meaning behind this was naturally not as simple as a spar. This kind of thing was not uncommon among scholars. Two scholars would compete in poetry, and the loser would have to admit that his talent was inferior to the other. For scholars who valued their reputation as much as their lives, this would be a stain that they would never be able to erase for the rest of their lives. Of course, the reason why Shen Zhao did this was because he did not believe that he would lose. The other was only a woman. How could she compare to him in terms of poetry? At this time, Wan Ruoqing quickly walked to the side of the white-clothed girl and hurriedly said, "He is the second most talented scholar of Qing'an Prefecture. He is extremely talented in poetry. Miss, please do not agree." Lu Rui naturally would not agree to a poetry competition with this Shen. She ignored Shen Zhao and looked indifferently at a certain figure in the back of the crowd. Everyone was puzzled when they saw this, and they looked in that direction as well. Being stared at by so many people, even if Li Yi wanted to watch the show, he could not continue. Moreover, his sister-in-law was about to be bullied. As the brother-in-law, it would be embarrassing for him not to stand out. "Miss Ruoqing, Miss Zimo, what a coincidence, we meet again." Zheng Zimo greeted Wan Ruoqing with a smile, and walked out from the crowd. The young prince, Li Xian, followed behind Li Yi. Seeing that he and the two girls seemed to know each other, his mind was filled with confusion. The last time the two went to the jadeite courtyard, he clearly did not know Zheng Zimo. How long had it been since then? How did the two of them hook up? "Young master." Seeing him here, Wan Ruoqing and Zheng Zimo's faces showed surprise. After a moment, the two seemed to think of something at the same time. They looked at each other, and then looked at Lu Rui. Could it be? An unbelievable guess surfaced in their minds. "It's him," someone in the crowd suddenly exclaimed. "He is the talent who wrote, 'Drinking Alone Under the Moon,' and 'Remembering Your Charm,' yesterday." At this time, someone finally recognized Li Yi. Just as Li Yi walked out, Su Wentian's expression changed and then darkened. It was because of this young man that he could not establish himself in his original circle, and became the laughingstock of others. Su Wentian's hatred for him was already deep in his bones. He is the talent who wrote those two poems? At the back of the crowd, Yang Yanzhou and the talent with the surname, one showed a trace of surprise on their faces. Could it be that the great second talent of Qing and Prefecture only knows how to bully women? Li Yi's lips twitched as he looked at Shen Zhao. Just now at the back, he had heard someone say that this guy was the second talent or something. It seemed like he was quite famous. Now, it seemed like this Shen Zhao's literary talent was still unknown. As for his character, tsk. Seeing him look at Shen Zhao with a mocking expression, the eyes of the few talented women of the Yunying Poetry Society lit up. At this moment, Li Yi's image in their hearts was without a doubt. even more glorious than before. At this moment, the way the talents looked at Li Yi was somewhat different. Everyone was very clear in their hearts that the young scholar had stepped forward at this time. And the meaning he wanted to express was very clear. Release those women. If you have any problems, come at me. Since he knew that Shen Zhao was the second talent of Qing and prefecture, and still dared to speak to him like this, was he arrogant and conceited? Or was he fearless? Of course, in the hearts of most people, they only felt that he was too arrogant. If the words just now were spoken by Yang Yanzhou, perhaps the crowd would not be so surprised. However, how could a nameless scholar compare to the famous Shen Zhao? Only an extremely small number of people with eyes knew that the person who could compose those two poems was also extremely talented. Even Shen Zhao might not be able to easily defeat him. At this moment, Ruoqing and Zheng Zimo's feelings were simply indescribable. Shock, surprise, joy, and a deep sense of disbelief. If their guess was correct, then no matter how talented Shen Zhao was in front of him, what could he amount to? Chapter 88. Even though the seats arranged for Wan Ruoqing and the others at the poetry meet were very remote and not easy to attract attention, ever since Shen Zhao brought these people over, many gazes were cast in this direction. Just now, when this unfamiliar scholar stood out and confronted Shen Zhao, the crowd began to discuss spiritedly. The crowd in the distance also finally realized that something seemed to have happened here, and more figures began to gather here. For people like me, exchanging pointers and poems is a common thing. There is no difference between talented men and women. I just wanted to see this lady's talent. What's wrong with that? There were already many people surrounding them. Shen Zhao's face recovered his gentle and refined expression as he countered with a question. Writing poems and lyrics are originally a way for scholars to cultivate their character and cultivate their character. It is not a tool for competing for power. To make things difficult for a woman like this is the behavior of a lowly person. It is not the behavior of a gentleman, Li Yi said faintly. Scholars usually boasted of themselves as gentlemen. To say not the behavior of a gentleman was already a great insult to them. No matter what, Shen Zhao was a person of status in Qing'an Prefecture. Just now he was called shameless by a woman. Now he was called a lowly person. Ever since he became famous, when had he been humiliated like this? The refined expression on Shen Zhao's face had long disappeared. It was so dark that it was about to drip water. At this time, the way some people looked at Li Yi changed. Poetry was a way to cultivate one's character and cultivate one's character. It was not a tool for competing for power. Not to mention his talent in poetry, just this insight alone was better than many self-proclaimed scholars. Jingui used his literary skills to become an official, which inevitably increased the utilitarian heart of the scholars. Over time, when it came to writing poems and lyrics, there would definitely be a difference in who was better and who was worse. The first and second scholars were actually fought out in this way. For this scholar to say such things, he was most likely a person with an indifferent temperament and no desire for fame and fortune. At this time, even those who were familiar with Shen Zhao couldn't help but look at him in a different light. Wan Ruoqing's beautiful eyes lit up. She had guessed correctly. Even though this gentleman was very talented, he was different from most scholars. He was truly a refined scholar with a noble heart. But when it came to money, forget it. Since he was a refined scholar, it wasn't a big deal to have some weird hobbies. It was precisely because of this that he was different from those people. Brother, since you have such a temperament, I'm sure your poetic talent isn't too bad either. I'm not talented, but I'd like to experience it for myself. Since they had already shed all pretense of cordiality, Shen Zhao no longer beat around the bush and spoke in an aggressive tone. At this point, there was no longer any room for negotiation. When there was a conflict between scholars, they naturally wouldn't fight with their fists like ordinary people. Whoever won would be in the right. Between them, it was popular to fight with words. The rights and wrongs of this matter had always been unclear. Even though Shen Zhao was indeed a little forceful, but this sort of thing was not uncommon in the circle of these scholars. Now that things had developed to this stage, no one cared about whether the cause was right or wrong. Once the two poems were brought out, it was clear who was better. If one's talent was not as good as the other, then one would naturally have to bow down to the other. Of course, the premise was that he would accept Shen Zhao's challenge. In reality, Li Yi was also considering this problem. For Shen Zhao to be called the second gifted scholar, he must have some talent. If Shen Zhao didn't come up with a poem that could suppress the situation, wouldn't he be at a disadvantage if Shen Zhao went back on his word? He didn't know many people here, so he wouldn't be at a disadvantage. However, he couldn't bear to bring out a really good poem. Those were all shining silver. Right now, Li Yi's career had just started and he was in urgent need of silver. That kind of poem could be sold for at least a few hundred taels of silver. It wasn't worth it to just throw it out like that. Little Prince Li Xian tugged on Li Yi's sleeve and whispered, "Don't fall for it. Even though this fellow's character is bad, he is very talented." He was obviously on Li Yi's side and didn't want Li Yi to be humiliated by Shen Zhao in public. Li Yi really didn't consider how talented Shen Zhao was. No matter how talented he was, could he be more talented than Li Bai or Su Shi? If he lost to a nobody like Shen Zhao in a poetry competition, Li Yi wouldn't have the face to meet these big shots in 100 years. No, he had to save face, and he couldn't take the loss. Li Yi decided to clarify things first. Therefore, while everyone was staring at him and waiting for his response, Li Yi quietly moved 2 steps towards Wan Ruoqing and whispered, "Miss Ruoqing, is there any reward for your poetry competition?" "Reward?" Wan Ruoqing was slightly stunned and looked at him with a puzzled expression. "That is, if someone comes up with a good poem, just a few hundred taels of silver." Wan Ruoqing was stunned and raised her head to look at him. After confirming that Li Yi wasn't joking, she said with a headache, "No." Although the two of them purposely lowered their voices, everyone's attention was on Li Yi. Many people still heard their conversation. Realizing that this scholar was actually hesitating on this question, everyone couldn't help but look at each other. Their hearts were like 10,000 galloping horses. If he really beat Shen Zhao tonight, his fame would definitely spread throughout Qingnan Prefecture. At that time, he could casually write a poem, and there would be countless people fighting over it. Why would he be short of a few hundred taels of silver? Those top scholars, which one of them lacked these worldly possessions? Of course, Li Yi didn't understand the situation in their circle, so he didn't think about this. "You want me to come up with a good poem without money? Dream on." Just as he was about to open his mouth to refuse, Shen Zhao's expression changed. He suddenly pulled off a jade pendant from his waist and said coldly, "This jade pendant of mine is worth at least 300 taels of silver. If you win, this jade pendant is yours." Li Yi took the jade pendant from his hand and played with it for a while. He felt that the feel of this thing was not bad, but he still didn't have an accurate estimate of the value of this jade pendant. He casually handed it to Li Xian and asked, "Look, is this thing worth 300 taels of silver?" Seeing this scene, the corner of Shen Zhao's mouth twitched and his fists tightened. The image of a scholarly scholar no longer existed. The expressions of the surrounding people were complicated. Their impression of this scholar was once again subverted. That Yunying Poetry Club, how did they find such an eclectic talent? Wan Ruoqing rubbed her brows helplessly. Zheng Zimo's pretty face was stunned. The women of the Yunying Poetry Society saw the gazes everyone was looking at them, and their faces couldn't help but blush. However, a glimmer of light flashed through Lu Ruo's beautiful eyes. 300 taels of silver. It sounded like a good deal. After being appraised by the knowledgeable young Prince Li Xian, Shen Zhao didn't use a fake jade pendant to trick them. This meant that this deal could be done. Under the gazes of the crowd, Li Yi finally nodded. "Since it is a competition, this place is naturally not suitable. Let's go over there." Shen Zhao looked at him coldly and led the way to the center of the crowd where the waterside pavilion was the most crowded. Su Wentian glanced at Li Yi with an extremely pleased expression, feeling extremely carefree in his heart as he hurriedly followed. He actually dared to compete with Shen Zhao. Tonight would be the night he would lose all face. When Shen Zhao and his group left in a grandiose manner, the surrounding people also looked at Li Yi with complicated expressions and quickly followed. Let's go over as well. Li Yi turned back to look at the people who were still standing in place. At this time, Wan Ruoqing bit her lip and suddenly raised her head to look at him. She asked, "We parted in a hurry yesterday. I still haven't asked for young master's name?" As soon as she finished speaking, Zheng Zimo also abruptly raised her head to look at Li Yi. An expression of extreme anticipation appeared on her pretty face. Zhao Yunru glanced at Wan Ruoqing and felt a bit anxious. Right now, they should be thinking about how to deal with Shen Zhao's provocation. This was not the time to ask these questions. Li Yi smiled and said, "This one is not asking for advice. This one is called Li Yi. Miss Ruoqing can directly call me by my name." Li Yi. Wan Ruoqing murmured these two words. Although she had already guessed it, she still couldn't believe it when she heard it from his own mouth. As expected, Zheng Zimo bit her lower lip tightly and looked at him with a complicated expression. All the doubts in her heart were completely resolved the moment she heard, "This one is called Li Yi." Chapter 89. Zheng Zimo now understood why he lost his composure when he heard her sing Celestial Magpie Bridge. It was because he was the one who wrote the poem. He probably didn't think that the poem written on the sky lantern would be picked up by Sister Ruoqing and spread throughout Qing'an Prefecture. Yesterday, he had been dismissive of Su Wentian's poems. With a wave of his hand, he had written 2 poems of a very high standard. Before this, no one knew that there was such a talent in Qing'an Fu. This made everyone very confused. All of this could be explained. This was because he was Li Yi, the one who wrote. If the love between 2 lovers lasts for a long time, why should they be together day and night? He was also the talent Li Yi that Sister Ruoqing, herself and countless women in Qing'an Prefecture yearned for. Li Yi. But the Li Yi who wrote, "If love lasts, why do we stay together day and night?" Zhao Yunru and the women of the Yunying Poetry Society were dumbfounded. They murmured to themselves, stunned for a moment and still in disbelief. He was the most mysterious scholar in Qing'an Prefecture recently, the one whose Celestial Magpie Bridge made Yang Yanzhou concede defeat, the one who made Xin Zhao declare that he would no longer compose qixi poems, the one who countless women, including themselves, wanted to meet. Zhao Yunru and the others' first reaction was disbelief. But when they thought of the 2 poems yesterday, they no longer had any doubts. In such a short amount of time, how could Qing'an Prefecture produce 2 talents who could stand shoulder to shoulder with Yang Yanzhou and Shen Zhao? So they were the same person. The young prince Li Xian stood there in a daze. His expression was one of shock. Was this guy famous in Qing'an Prefecture? Why hadn't he heard of him before? What are you all standing there for? Li Yi looked at them with confusion. He shook his head and walked toward the water pavilion in the center. At this time, because of Shen Zhao, the water pavilion in the center had attracted the attention of countless people. "Did you hear that young Master Shen is going to compete with someone in poetry today?" "What? Isn't young Master Shen the number 2 talent? Who else does he need to compete with? Could it be Yang Yanzhou?" "That doesn't seem to be the case. We'll know what's going on once we keep watching. How dare he compete with young Master Shen? Isn't he digging his own grave?" Under Shen Zhao's deliberate efforts, the news quickly spread throughout the entire Mianxiu Garden, and the crowd began to gather in that direction. When Wan Ruoqing, Zheng Zimo, and the woman from the Yunying Poetry Club walked over behind Li Yi, they were also shocked by such a scene. But when he thought of his poem, The Immortal at the Magpie Bridge, Shen Zhao no longer dared to compose any more qixi poems, and his heart immediately calmed down. Is that young master going to compete with young Master Shen? That young master is so handsome. This is a competition of literary talent, not who is good looking. But he really is better looking than young Master Shen. It was not convenient for the women in the hall to get close, so they could only watch from afar. Occasionally, their voices could be heard. In the center of the waterside pavilion, in a spacious pavilion, Shen Zhao was already standing in front of a table. On the table was a brush, ink, paper and inkstone. His expression was calm and unreadable. At this moment, This place had already been surrounded by many scholars. As the second most talented scholar in Qing'an Prefecture, Shen Zhao was naturally a hot topic. The news of Shen Zhao's poetry competition tomorrow would definitely be the topic of conversation among the scholars of Qing'an Prefecture. Brother Yanzhou, Yang Yanzhou, and the scholar with the surname Wan were also in the crowd. Suddenly, a voice came from beside them. Looking back, they found it was a scholar they were familiar with. That person looked at Yang Yanzhou and asked in confusion, "Someone actually agreed to compete with Shen Zhao in poetry? Does he not know that in Qing'an Prefecture, Shen Zhao's poetry skills are second only to Brother Yanzhou's? This is a situation where he will definitely lose. Brother Yanzhou, what do you think about this?" Yang Yanzhou shook his head and said slowly, "Definitely lose? I don't think so." "Brother Yanzhou, what do you mean?" Yang Yanzhou actually didn't think Shen Zhao was optimistic. That person's expression froze. He had a faint premonition. Tonight, there would probably be big news. The surrounding people had been paying attention to the conversation between Yang Yanzhou and him. Hearing this, they immediately focused their attention and listened carefully. What if that person is the scholar who wrote, raising a cup to the bright moon, facing the shadows to form three people? After Yang Yanzhou said this, the surrounding crowd was silent for a moment. Then, they immediately burst into an uproar. It was also at this time that Li Yi and the others finally walked over. When they walked to the table beside Shen Zhao turned his head to look at him and said lightly, "Since it is the Mid-Autumn Poetry Meet, the two of us will use the Mid-Autumn Festival as the theme. We will each write a poem. As for who will win and who will lose, let the scholars here judge." Naturally, Li Yi had no objections to this. After Shen Zhao finished speaking, he already picked up his brush and began to write on the xian paper in front of him. His brush moved like dragons and snakes. Regardless of the content, it was full of vigor. A scholar came closer and stretched his head to take a look. His face involuntarily revealed an expression of envy. He murmured, as expected of the second scholar, "This new Mid-Autumn Festival poem is actually better than the one he just took out." After reading out Shen Zhao's unfinished poem in a low voice, the surrounding scholars all gasped in admiration. Shen Zhao's expression did not change, but he was very proud of himself. This poem was originally prepared to compete with Yang Yanzhou tonight. It was his hope of winning the title of the first scholar in Qing'an Prefecture. Naturally, the standard of this poem was not low. Shen Zhao had already written half a poem, but the scholar opposite him only picked up his brush. Someone walked closer, and when they stretched their head to take a look, they found that the xian paper in front of him was empty. There were no words. Could it be, he knows that he can't beat Shen Zhao, so he got cold feet? Just as everyone was having these suspicions, little did they know that at this moment, Li Yi was also in a bit of a dilemma. Just now, he had casually picked up his brush, and had forgotten that with his unique handwriting, no one present knew how to appreciate it. If he wrote it in this kind of situation, he was afraid that it would be embarrassing. After thinking about it, he made up his mind, dipped the brush in ink, and put the brush down. Very quickly, familiar handwriting appeared on the surface of the paper. Wan Ruoqing and Zheng Zimo lowered their heads to look. After seeing the unique handwriting, they looked at each other and no longer had any doubts in their hearts. This handwriting was the same as the original manuscript of the Immortals of the Magpie Bridge. Other than him, which other scholar could write this? The young prince Li Xian looked down in confusion. His eyes suddenly widened, as if he had seen something inconceivable. Seeing that he had finally put down his brush, a moment later, someone couldn't resist his curiosity and came forward to take a look. Suddenly, an extremely shocked expression appeared on his face, as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. He raised his head to look at Li Yi, then looked at the handwriting on the paper with some uncertainty. Finally, his expression became strange. This handwriting. I'm afraid that only a child who has just learned how to write would be able to write this? Following that person's low murmur, a few more people came forward. Wan Ruoqing's pretty face changed slightly when she saw the change in everyone's expression. She immediately took a step forward, grabbed a piece of paper from the side table, and hurriedly began to write on it. A moment later, she looked at Li Yi again. After distinguishing the words and sentences, she started writing again on the paper raft. During this process, an indescribable expression gradually appeared on her pretty face as she looked at the words she had finished transcribing. When Li Yi stopped writing to check if he had missed anything, a piece of paper filled with hairpin-style small regular script had already been passed out of Wan Ruoqing's hands. Let's see what he has written. After seeing Li Yi's handwriting, the surrounding scholars began to doubt whether he had ever been educated. They smiled as they took the paper and looked at it. Shui Diao Getu. The first thing that entered their eyes were these 4 words. When will the moon be bright and clear? Holding a cup of wine, I asked the clear sky. Someone held the paper and read it softly. Not long after, the surrounding noise gradually quieted down. Chapter 90. Shui Diao Getu. Shui Diao Getu. I'm afraid no one will dare to compose a mid-autumn festival poem today. A blank expression appeared on the scholar's face. He had already been shaken by the paper raft in his hand. It's not just today. I'm afraid that from now on, it will be difficult to compose a mid-autumn festival poem. Yang Yinzhou's eyes were also filled with shock. Even though he was known as the #1 scholar in Qing'an Prefecture, he would never be able to compose a poem of this standard. At this moment, all the scholars at the scene were no longer as noisy as before. Yang Yinzhou's gaze once again swept across the paper raft, and finally noticed the name at the bottom. His heart suddenly jumped, and he exclaimed, Li Yi. What? Hearing this, everyone's bodies trembled. They all lowered their heads. In the next moment, an even greater uproar erupted. He is Li Yi. Li Yi from Immortal Magpie Bridge ? That drinking alone under the moon was also written by him. The moment they saw the name of the poem, the shock in their hearts exceeded the poem itself. Ever since the Mid-Autumn Festival a month ago, everyone had their own guesses as to who the author of Immortal Magpie Bridge was. But it was undeniable that this person's talent was astonishing. With just one Mid-Autumn Festival poem, he had already been elevated to the same status as Yang Yinzhou and Shen Zhao. Including Yang Yinzhou, who knew how many people wanted to meet this scholar named Li Yi, but no one was able to do so. No one thought that he would appear in such a manner. With a wave of his hand, he produced an extremely high-standard Mid-Autumn Festival poem. Not just Shen Zhao, but even among all the scholars in the Jing Kingdom, who could compare to him? Thinking of this, everyone couldn't help but glance at Shen Zhao, who was still happily writing. The expressions on their faces were especially interesting. A month ago, because of the Immortal Magpie Bridge, Shen Zhao tore his proud work into pieces in front of all the scholars in Qing'an Prefecture. He announced that he would never compose a Mid-Autumn Festival poem again. From today onwards, he probably wouldn't even be able to compose a Mid-Autumn Festival poem. If 2 lovers love each other for a long time, why would they stay together day and night? Raising a cup to the bright moon, the shadow becomes 3 people. May we live together for a long time, Yang Yinzhou muttered to himself, and a self-mocking smile appeared on his face. He said, everyone says that I, Yang Yinzhou, am the #1 scholar in Qing'an Prefecture. When I compete with others, I have never tasted defeat in poetry. Today I know that there are people better than you. From now on, the title of #1 scholar in Qing'an Prefecture should not be mentioned again. Brother Yinzhou. Scholar 1 opened his mouth, but in the end, he only patted his shoulder and didn't say anything. The Immortal on the Magpie Bridge, Drinking Alone Under the Moon, Shui Diao Getu. These poems were enough to scare many people to death. If Yang Yinzhou still carried the title of the foremost scholar in Qing'an Prefecture, this was not praise for him, but a great mockery. He looked at the back of the scholar with a complicated expression and sighed in his heart. Since Li Yi was born, how could Yang Yinzhou be born? He couldn't help but look in Shen Zhao's direction. He must have committed too many sins in his past life to have to compete with this kind of person. After today, Shen Zhao would probably have a hard time keeping a foothold among the scholars in Qing'an Prefecture. Look, even though this style of writing is not restricted by rules, the strokes are smooth, the structure is simple, and the strokes are continuous. Amidst the frenzy, there is a hint of elegance. I'm afraid that he is quite accomplished in calligraphy. A scholar stared at the manuscript on the table and suddenly exclaimed. When the crowd heard this, they all lowered their heads to look at it. For some reason, the words that looked like a child's scribble now looked much more pleasing to the eye. There seemed to be a certain rhythm between the lines. Thinking about it carefully, what the scholar said just now did seem to make some sense. Brother Wang's words are reasonable. Our eyes were blind and almost made a mistake. Not bad, not bad. How could someone with such talent not know calligraphy? Could it be that this style was created by this brother? Yang Yinzhou stood to the side and listened to the discussions of the crowd. A trace of doubt floated onto his face. Could it be that the other party's cultivation level was too high? Even with his skill in calligraphy, he could not comprehend the beauty of this style? Even Li Yi couldn't help but blush when he heard these words. He coughed to hide the awkwardness in his heart. When he put down his brush, he saw Li Xian, Wan Ruoqing, Zheng Zumo, and the others standing behind him. They looked at him with a complicated expression. What is it? Is there ink on my face? Li Yi was stunned and asked in confusion. He reached out and wiped his face. He looked down at his palms. There was no ink. No one nodded and no one spoke. Li Xian looked at him with a burning gaze. It was as if he was meeting him for the first time. Originally, he thought that the other party was an interesting scholar who was good at painting, greedy for money, and had a low tolerance for alcohol. On top of that, he had cured his mother's depression. His impression of him improved greatly, and he was willing to interact with him. But who would have thought that this scholar, who did not have any outstanding qualities other than his good looks, was so talented that even the top scholar of Qing and prefecture had to admit defeat? This guy was even better at hiding than he was. Wan Ruoqing, Zheng Zumo, and the others were just as shocked as he was. First, they found out that the young master from yesterday was Li Yi, the one who created Immortal Magpie Bridge. Before they could recover, Shuidiao Getu appeared out of nowhere. Not only did it stun all the scholars present, it also stunned them. Especially when they remembered that he was a member of the Yunying Poetry Society in name. They all wondered if they were dreaming. Pa! Shen Zhao threw the brush in his hand onto the table. The writing on the Xian paper was vigorous and powerful. It was vigorous and free. Even if one ignored the content, it could still be considered a good piece of calligraphy. After all, his reputation as the second scholar did not come from nowhere. To be recognized by so many proud scholars in Qing and prefecture, Shen Zhao definitely had some ability. He turned his head and saw that the scholar opposite him seemed to have finished writing. The corner of his mouth twitched and he strode over. Because of the distance, when Shen Zhao was concentrating on writing, he did not hear the discussion. At this moment, he walked in front of Li Yi's table and lowered his head to look. His expression froze for a moment, then he laughed loudly. Is this your work, or is it a child's random scribbling? At this moment, Shen Zhao no longer had any doubts about the outcome of this competition. However, as he laughed, his laughter gradually became softer. Because at this moment, he was the only one laughing. The surrounding talents all looked at him with a strange expression. The smile on Shen Zhao's face froze. An extremely bad feeling suddenly arose in his heart. Brother Shen. At this moment, Su Wentian walked over in a daze. In his hand was a paper raft. He looked at Li Yi with a complicated expression and handed the paper raft to Shen Zhao. Chapter 91. At the other end of the pavilion, countless women raised their heads and looked in a certain direction, their hearts filled with anticipation. In the pavilion where the competition was taking place, other than a few talented women, almost all of them were men. With their status, it was naturally not appropriate for them to go over. Who do you guys think will win this competition? A pretty woman asked with her hand on her cheek. Of course it will be young Master Shen. I also think it will be young Master Shen. Yes, young Master Shen is so talented. How could he lose to a nobody? The surrounding women all spoke up, their thoughts shockingly in unison. No one felt that the nameless scholar could win against the second talent of Qing and Fu, Xin Zhao. After all, Xin Zhao had been famous in Qing and Fu for a long time. In the hearts of these women, his position was naturally higher. But that young master isn't a nobody. A young girl interrupted. Hearing this, a woman asked, "Right, I still don't know what his name is, Xiao Yun, do you know?" The young woman shook her head and said, "I also don't know what that young master is called, but when I came over from that side, I heard them say that young master is the one who composed Drinking Alone Under the Moon and Nian Nu yesterday." "What? It's actually that scholar." Among these women, there were clearly many who knew these two poems. After a moment of surprise, they said hesitantly, "If it's that scholar, he might not necessarily lose. But why is young Master Shen competing with that young master in poetry?" Competing in poetry between scholars was a very common thing, and not something to be surprised about. But usually if there was no conflict between the two, it would just be a normal exchange of pointers. But if it was elevated to the level of a battle, it meant that the conflict between the two could not be resolved. The young woman who had just spoken looked around and said somewhat mysteriously, "I heard that because young Master Shen made things difficult for the talented women of the Yunying Poetry Society, that young master, as a member of the Yunying Poetry Society, could not stand young Master Shen's actions, so he stood out." Everyone knows what happened next. Ah, how is it possible? How could young Master Shen be this kind of person? I've heard before that Xin Zhao was arrogant and narrow-minded. I thought it was just a rumor. Who would have thought? I suddenly don't want young Master Shen to win. Me too. After the young girl's words were confirmed by a few other women who were also in the know, the balance in these women's hearts finally tilted. At this moment, a young lady dressed like a servant ran over from afar with a paper raft in her hand. She ran to the lady's side and handed the paper raft to her while panting. "Is there any news from there?" When the women saw this, they all crowded around him. "How was it? How was it? Who won?" "When will the bright moon appear?" I asked the clear sky with a cup of wine in my hand. "I wonder what year it is in the heavenly palace." That woman cast her gaze up and recited in a low voice. Her beautiful eyes suddenly burst out with a strange splendor. The few women gathered their heads, and after a moment, their pretty faces revealed the same expression as hers. This was written by that young master? After a moment, the woman raised her head and looked at the young servant girl. She asked in disbelief, "Miss Name." The young maid had run all the way here, and was panting from exhaustion. She finally caught her breath and opened her big eyes wide. She hurriedly pointed at the bottom corner of the paper raft and said, "Name? What name?" The young lady, who looked like a well-bred lady, looked in the direction that the young maid was pointing. In the next moment, her beautiful eyes involuntarily widened. Her cherry lips slightly parted as she cried out in surprise, "Li Yi." The name Li Yi was not an unfamiliar name to the women of Qing and Fu. Ever since the immortal Magpie Bridge came out, it was unknown how many young girls in love, young married women, on lonely nights, in the depths of their chambers would recite. If the feelings between two could last forever, why would they stay together day and night? While thinking of their absent lovers, even those unmarried young girls would imagine a certain scene in their minds. Perhaps in their erotic dreams at night, they would occasionally dream of that scholar named Li Yi. For the women of this era, a man's talent was, without a doubt, a fatal attraction to them. Appearance was actually ranked lower. Of course, if he was a scholar with both talent and appearance, he would certainly be pursued by countless women. Is that the Li Yi from the Immortal of the Magpie Bridge? Ah, that handsome gentleman, is that Li Yi? In an instant, countless women raised their heads and looked in the direction of the water pavilion in the center. Their eyes were filled with a strange light. I hope that people live long, thousands of miles apart. When Shen Zhao read to this point, his voice was already trembling. Fine beads of sweat appeared on his forehead. He suddenly raised his head to look at him and said in a trembling voice, "You are the Immortal of the Magpie Bridge. Brother, if you have finished writing, why don't you hand it over to the scholars to judge?" Li looked at him and asked with a smile, Hearing this, Shen Zhao's face turned pale. He knew his own limits. The other party had even brought out such words. What need was there to judge? He was just asking to be humiliated. I lost. Shen Zhao's face was pale. After squeezing out these words from between his teeth, he turned and left. Brother, please wait. Seeing that Shen Zhao was about to leave, Li hurriedly called out to him. What else do you want? A trace of anger appeared on Shen Zhao's face. He had already lost face in front of everyone today. Was the other party still not willing to let it go? Li didn't speak, but his eyes looked at his waist. Shen Zhao finally remembered something. His face darkened even more. He tore off the jade pendant at his waist and casually threw it over. Li hurriedly caught it. If it was broken, 300 liang of silver would be gone. When he walked to the side of his table, Shen Zhao's footsteps paused. He grabbed the poem he had just written and tore it into pieces. The scholars saw this familiar scene and couldn't help but sigh in their hearts. If they had known this would happen, they wouldn't have done it in the first place. Li held the jade pendant in his hand. In his heart, he was thinking about going to a pawn shop later. 300 liang of silver was enough to rent a shop in a slightly more prosperous area in Qing and Prefecture. At that moment, a delicate young girl walked in from outside. She walked to Li Yi's side and asked gently, May I ask if you are Li Yi Li? Li didn't know what this young girl wanted. He nodded in confusion. The young girl smiled and handed over a piece of paper. Will you be free tomorrow? My young mistress would like to invite you to her residence for a chat. This looks like Miss Chen's servant. Miss Chen is official Chen's daughter. Seeing this, all of the candidates had expressions of shock and envy on their faces. Before Li Yi could react, a few more young girls walked in from outside. After bowing to Li Yi, they spoke in a gentle voice. My young mistress admires your talent very much. Tomorrow, there will be a banquet at the Drunken Fragrance brothel. Will you be free? My young mistress. My young mistress. That's Miss Chen's servant, that's Lu Qiaoqiao's servant, even Prefectural Magistrate Dong's daughter. Behind Li Yi, the little prince, Li Xian, stared blankly at this scene. His expression was incomparably complicated. Chapter 92. Since they were daughters of noble families, they had been taught from a young age that their every action had to be dignified and courteous. Not to mention daughters of noble families like the daughter of Magistrate Dong, or the daughter of the Chen family. Even the slightly more famous courtesans of Qing and Prefecture were usually very reserved and would never publicly invite a stranger. Although most of these girls had only sent their own servant girls, the personal servant girls represented their own wishes. Li Xian really couldn't understand why a mere poem would have such a strong attraction for these girls. It should be known that even though he was a little prince and a relative of the imperial family, these girls only maintained proper etiquette when they saw him. They definitely wouldn't go this far. In this aspect, his influence as a little prince wasn't even as great as Yang Yanzhou or Xin Zhao and other famous scholars in Qing and Prefecture. But he had never heard of the daughter of Magistrate Dong ever inviting Yang Yanzhou. Li Xian was very certain that if Li nodded his head right now, perhaps there would be many girls willing to offer themselves to sleep with him tonight. This kind of thing was not rare for scholars in Qing and Prefecture. After tonight, his talent would spread. In the future, he wouldn't even have to pay to visit brothels, and there would probably be girls willing to throw themselves at him. Don't doubt this. There are historical records that show Lu Yong and Tang Bohu were both masters who didn't pay to visit brothels. Spending a night with the #1 scholar of Qing and Prefecture was a good opportunity for those prostitutes to become famous. If they could get him to write a poem, something along the lines of flirtatious, graceful, and devastatingly beautiful, it would be a good hype and would greatly increase the attention of the market. And this kind of handsome, talented scholar was the ideal candidate for Rui in the hearts of the daughters of noble families. In his mind, the scene of Li Yi being surrounded by all kinds of girls floated up. If he could receive his true teachings, in the vast Qing and Prefecture, would there be a girl he couldn't handle? Thinking of this, Li Xian made a decision in his heart. He was definitely going to be a friend. Looking at the girls in front of him handing over handkerchiefs, invitations, and the like, Li felt a headache coming on. After living 2 lives, he really couldn't handle such a scene. He looked to Lu Rui for help, only to find that she was standing there, staring at Zheng Zimo. No one knew what she was thinking. Just when Li Yi was about to be overwhelmed by the enthusiasm of these girls, Mississippi Lu finally looked over, as if she had heard the call in his heart. Li gave her a look, and Lu Rui walked over slowly. The girls felt a gentle force pushing them away. Then, they saw the lady in white grab the young man's shoulder, and with a light leap, the 2 of them rose into the air, flew over the heads of the candidates, and flew out of the pavilion. In the blink of an eye, they disappeared before their eyes. This scene truly stunned everyone present. The atmosphere was quiet for a moment, and then immediately became uproar. Did I see it wrong? They just flew over my head? That's a fairy. It's over, that young man flew away. How are we going to explain this to the mistress? So powerful. Some of the candidates fell into a daze when they saw the Shui Diao Getu. Only now did they come back to their senses, and involuntarily let out a long sigh. That person's attainments in poetry were truly impressive. After today, the #1 scholar in Qing and prefecture would most likely be someone else. So powerful. Li Xian's eyes were full of envy. If he had this kind of ability, in the entire Qing and prefecture, whether it was the daughter of Magistrate Dong or the mistress of official Chun, or even the prostitutes in the brothels who only sold their skills but not their bodies, who wouldn't admire him? So powerful. The 2 plainclothed bodyguards behind Li Xian looked at each other, their eyes filled with shock. This woman's martial arts were extraordinary, and her Qinggong was even more so. Before this, they had never heard of such a person. When had such a person appeared in the martial arts world? As expected, there was always someone better. The martial arts world was vast, and there were many capable people. When they returned, they had to report to the young master. The young master's guards would probably need to be strengthened. Deep shock appeared on Wan Ruoqing and Zheng Zimo's pretty faces. They didn't think that the woman who had been standing quietly beside them was such a powerful heroine. After a moment, Wan Ruoqing came back to herself and sighed softly. Li is overflowing with talent and rare in this world. Once the Shui Diao Getu appeared, it already stood at the peak of the Mid-Autumn Poetry Festival. If future generations want to surpass it, it will be harder than ascending to the heavens. It will probably be like the immortal of the Magpie Bridge, and be passed down through the ages. Zheng Zimo turned her head and looked at her. She took a small step forward and said with a smile, "Sister Ruoqing is right." Wan Ruoqing didn't answer. As if she had thought of something, her eyes suddenly looked at the table in front of her. Seeing this, the expression on Zheng Zimo's pretty face changed slightly. She cursed in her heart that it was still discovered by Sister Ruoqing. With quick steps, she quickly put away the original manuscript of Shui Diao Getu and held it tightly in her arms. All of this happened in a flash. When Wan Ruoqing reacted, Zheng Zimo had already rolled the rice paper into a tube and sat in front of the table. She blinked her big innocent eyes and looked at her with a smile. At this time she had only taken one step. "Zimo you." Wan Ruoqing's cherry lips opened slightly. Her pretty face was full of surprise as she looked at Zheng Zimo. She was a little speechless. Now that she had it, a sly smile appeared on Zheng Zimo's face. She looked at Wan Ruoqing and said, "Sister Ruoqing, you already have Immortal Magpie Bridge. Why don't you give the Shui Diao Getu to me?" At this time, the top artist of the jadeite courtyard was like a sly little fox. Her face was full of a smile of success. Not far away, Yang Yinzhou's footsteps stopped, and a wry smile appeared on his face. Someone else had actually made the first move at this time. Outside the garden, Li held onto a big tree and closed his eyes. Only then did the dizziness in his mind subside a little. He had never experienced the feeling of a roller coaster in his previous life. After coming to this world, he had experienced it twice. He was extremely curious. As a woman, why did Lu Rui always not take the right path and like to fly around on the wall? After a long time, when the palpitation completely disappeared, Li turned his head and looked at the pretty woman beside him. His eyes were filled with hidden bitterness as he said, Lu Rui, you will lose me like this. If you can't even endure this little bump, you won't be able to become a second-rate master even if you practice martial arts for the rest of your life. The sword-hugging woman leaned on a book and glanced at him. The reason she gave actually made Li Yi speechless. As she spoke, one of her lily-white hands retracted into her sleeves. Li Yi didn't see the paper raft that she had secretly hidden. You're tuning in to the Li Mei's Wuxia Whispers YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.